I'm going to start in a few minutes, okay?
Okay.
All right.
Good morning. It's great to be back here in Turks and Caicos. Welcome once again to the Compliance and Risk Seminar conducted or facilitated by the Financial Services Commission of the Turks and Caicos in collaboration with the Bahamas Institute of Financial Services. My name is Miguel Pratt. I am the Program Coordinator at the Bahamas Institute of Financial Services. Well, first I want to thank Mr. Kevin Higgins and his team for once again allowing us the great opportunity to come back to Turks and Caicos. I think this is our 5th training seminar. We started off with some anti-money laundering, we did a little trust, and now we have our 2nd compliance seminar. If you notice in your book, we have a lot to cover, so I'll be brief. Therefore, I will go ahead and ask Mr. Simmons from the Financial Services Commission to give the opening and official welcome remarks.
Thank you, Miguel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today to our one-day compliance seminar facilitated by Bahamas Institute of Financial Services and the Turks and Caicos Islands Financial Services. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here, especially those whom I like to refer to as the heavy hitters, bankers and accountants and corporate secretaries and so on. We here at the Financial Services Commission would like to thank the Bahamas Institute of Financial Services for partnering with us to bring you this important seminar on compliance. And we trust that you will find it both informative and enlightening. We would also like to thank Mr. Hubert Edwards, Deputy Managing Director of Bank of Bahamas International, personally for his efforts in this regard. We trust you will find his work here today rewarding and appreciated. I'd like to state how pleased I am to see on the agenda a session on corporate governance following lunch. I know this is a time when blood leaves the brain and goes to the stomach to assist in digestion, and we tend to nod off during this process. But please try to make sure that we stay awake and fully digest the details of this very important topic. Please bear with me a moment while I share with you my own experience so far in corporate governance. A few months ago, our Managing Director, Mr. Higgins, circulated among board members details of a corporate governance seminar to be put on by the Caribbean Governance Training Institute and to be held in Castries, St. Lucia. After studying the brochure and seeing the topics covered in the seminar, I immediately emailed Mr. Higgins back saying that this seemed to be a conference from which I thought I could benefit as a board director. When I arrived at the 3-day conference, I was pleased to see that our chairman and 3 other persons from corporations in Turks and Caicos in attendance. The conference lived up to its billing. It was informative and enlightening, and reinforced most of what I thought to be the duties of corporate directors. However, it went a step further. It refocused my attention and made me more aware of the importance of corporate governance and the board's role in this important responsibility. I came back from the conference, wrote my report, and presented it by email round robin to our board members. The topic was immediately made an item placed on our next meeting agenda. At that meeting, the board agreed with me that corporate governance is an all-important responsibility of the board of directors, and that we needed a corporate governance committee. And of course, you know who was penalized or rewarded with the chairmanship of that committee. Our first task that we embarked on was the revision and expansion of our mission statement to form a more comprehensive mission, vision, and value statement. In other words, our corporate governance committee is well on its way. A couple of weeks ago, I got an email from Ms. Williams, Mr. Higgins' personal assistant, asking if I would bring opening remarks here today. And a few hours later, I received another email asking if it was possible to tie my opening remarks to corporate governance and compliance. It took me a few minutes to think through his request, but I think I eventually got it. What Mr. Higgins wants us all to know and understand is that risk management, compliance, and corporate governance go hand in hand. All facets of risk need to be properly managed. If you're not doing this, you're not compliant. If you're not compliant, you're not practicing good corporate governance. Risk management and compliance are vital parts of corporate governance. If in your roles as directors and senior management, you are not giving proper time and attention to this very important responsibility, you are placing yourself and your corporation at risk. The subtopics to be covered in both morning and afternoon session will give you a sound introduction to what risk management, compliance, and corporate governance are all about. How important and inseparable these responsibilities are. And once these matters are understood, the linkage between corporate governance, risk management, and compliance become a clear and natural progression. As you will understand the need for your company to become and maintain compliant, thereby fulfilling a part of your corporate governance and helping you to recognize the need to create and maintain that corporate compliance culture. On behalf of our chairman, Sir Errol Allen, and our board of directors, our managing director, Mr. Higgins, and the staff of the FSC, it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. Please enjoy and be fulfilled. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simmons. We have Mr. Edwards' bio on the third page. I'm not going to go ahead and give it all, but I could sum it up in the sentence. Google risk management and compliance, and he comes up 1, 2, and 3. All right? Mr. Edwards knows everything there is to know about risk management and compliance. Trust me. He's been teaching for us for 10 plus years. Currently he serves as our president at the Institute. So folks, you're in good hands today. Please put Mr. Edwards to the test. Ask him anything there is about risk management compliance. He doesn't mind being interrupted. He wants you to make an interactive section. Okay? So let's put our hands together and give Mr. Edwards a warm welcome.
Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Can you hear me? Okay, that's important because I can't be behind the mic. I want to thank you, Mr. Simmons, for your opening remarks. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. This is my second time in Turks and Caicos at the seminar, actually my fourth time in Turks and Caicos, and I've always enjoyed being here. Today we have a very long task ahead of us. I see the agenda says 3 or so, right? I just want you to kind of reframe your minds a little bit, because we may go a little bit beyond 3:30, not more than 4 o'clock. But definitely we have a lot of ground to cover. We're talking about a very important set of topics. And before I go, initially I was told that there were only going to be 10 persons in this seminar. So I have 10 questions for each. Given that it's well more than that, I'm just going to randomly pick out a couple of persons and just ask what exactly it is that you expect from this seminar. And don't be shy. I start with you, sir. Very quickly, we anticipate from you.
My name is Alex from First Global Insurance Brokers. I'm a little excited about what will happen today. I'm more on the compliance side. I'm the compliance officer of the company.
Okay.
And I've heard around that Turks and Caicos is working on being compliant as far as anti-money laundering.
That's what you're looking for. All right, thank you. Let me get the lady over this side. You, ma'am. Yes, you are there.
Good morning, my name is Marjorie. I'm from NCSE Money Services. From the seminar, mainly I need to know what's new.
Need to know what's new.
What's new?
Okay.
As it relates to compliance.
As it relates to compliance.
Thank you.
You, sir.
Andy Newman, Payment Corporate Services. Now, I'd like to know how is risk management compliance requirements these days that is suited to very small 1-, 2-, and 3-man businesses like we have here. I don't think that 2-page manuals are very relevant to many people in the business. But that's the end line. I'd like us to know more about how what your presentation affects the very small companies.
Okay. Great. And let me get one more person over here. Somebody is not looking up any at all. Don't want me to call them. You're right there. See that here. You want to? Yeah. Yes. Okay, all right, that's great. That's good. Let me ask one last question. By a show of hands, companies which are, say, about between 1 and 10 persons. Okay. 10 to 20. 20 and over. 20 and over. 50 and over. Good. So it's a good thing to assume that we're dealing with 50 and under. All right? All right, so let's get started. There you go.
Let's make an operational risk in this one. Oh, sorry.
All right. Good. So this is what we intended to do today. We intended to be very practical and participative. We need to talk about why risk management is important. What is risk management? Explore some of the fundamentals of risk management and the type of risk. We're going to explore risk assessment and risk management process. We're going to undertake a very simple case study. You're not here today just to listen. You're here to work. And that work is going to help you. And I hear what most of the persons said in terms of small companies. Don't worry about it. Risk management applies to a company of 1, if that was possible, to a company of 1 billion, right? It doesn't matter. The size is not important. It's all can be tailored to what you're trying to achieve. Risk. Yes.
You said we could interrupt.
Yes.
But isn't it,
That was a question.
isn't it very relevant? It seems to me it's very relevant because in understanding, as you do already, that we're all fundamentally small businesses.
Yes.
In most cases that I foresee in these type of things, it's where, let's say the frontline staff are the ones who are making these calls on accepting new business. And as opposed to the, shall we say, the stakeholders in the business, the principals of the business, the shareholders, the managing directors, the presidents, call them what you will. I could be wrong, but my suspicion is in this room, most of the people who are making those initial decisions on taking on new business and risk are those people right at the top of the food chain. And I think that impacts on a lot of this, because a lot of this is actually aimed at the teller at the bank, or the, shall we say, the junior bank officer, who's one of 400 people.
Okay. All right, Miguel, help me out there. I want you to part that for me. We're going to come back to that. I'm not going to answer that now. I will show you exactly how that works as we move through it. So, just right. Who is the director to? Risk taking is fundamental in the provision of financial service. Businesses are in the business of making money, true. If you do not take risk, then you won't be able to make money. So it's important that you understand that risk taking is important. The only way to avoid risk totally is to not get in the business any at all. So you want to avoid all of the risk of financial services, then don't go into business. Become a plumber, become a tailor, and you avoid all risk related to financial services. The challenge for compliance professionals, and I like compliance professionals, because that's what I'm going to treat you as to every single person, compliance professional or risk manager, is to minimize or mitigate the exposure which would adversely affect legitimate business. So you can't stop the risk. The risk always exists. What do? You work to minimize or mitigate it. And really it's a balance which is driven by the risk appetite. By risk appetite, and we'll come back to these things, all of these words which you see highlighted. What is it that what type of view you take towards risk? Some companies, a big company may say, I'll take that project which will make me $1 billion. You will say no, because you're a smaller company. Because the same risk, opportunity, which could make you $1 billion, could also cost you $1 billion. What's your risk appetite? Do you want it? And I want to make this point. So if you don't learn anything else, learn this from this first slide. Right? So I can wrap up right here. Understanding the nature and the causal linkages, causal, one thing impacting another, between the different forms of risk is fundamental to a compliance function. It's not just about persons running up and down and writing manuals and writing policy. There is a process happening. There's a risk management process which is happening on an ongoing basis. All right? And it's very important that you know that. So as an introduction, Mr. Simons is here from the regulators. It says here, and this is from the Basel Committee on Risk Management. Basel Committee, as you know, Bank of International Settlement, those are the gods as far as banking and financial services is concerned. So the supervisor must be satisfied that banks and banking groups have in place comprehensive risk management process, including board and senior management oversight, that is corporate governance, to identify, evaluate, monitor, and control or mitigate all material risks. And material there is important. And to assess the overall capital adequacy in relation to their risk profile. These processes should be commensurate with the size and complexity of the organization. So, if you are a two-man company, your complexity is going to be totally different from a 100-person company. And that's what I'm saying. It's the same principle which runs through what you're doing, but the complexity is going to be different. IOSCA says the regulator should promote and allow for effective management of risk and ensure that capital and other prudential requirements are sufficient, and address the appropriate risk taking, allow the absorption of some losses, and check for excessive risk taking. So when you're taking too much risk, that's not a good thing, right? So you need risk management processes in place. At the end of the day, this is what basically happened. It talks about about capital. And I want you guys to bear that in mind as we go through. Capital is the thing which keeps a company going. Capital is designed to absorb unknown risk. Yeah? If you wipe that out, what happened to your company? So at the end of the day, you're managing to protect what? Capital. What does capital represent? Huh?
Cash.
Cash? No, kind of. It could be cash. What does capital represent? It represents everything, that's true, but what does it represent? Who put capital there? Huh? Investors. So it represents shareholder value. What's the purpose of a business? To make money. What does that mean in terms of the shareholder? Creating shareholder value. So risk management, therefore, is part of the process which helps to protect and enhance shareholders' value. In the first place, you put in $100, you don't want to lose it, do you? What do you want it to do? To grow, right? So first of all, you don't want to lose it, so risk management protects that $100. And in the second instance, it enhances. So that's what risk management is about, or at least part of what it is about. So at the end of the day, right, it's really round about capital adequacy and risk mitigation. You cannot avoid the risk in most instances, right? So what you want to do is to mitigate. So consequently, compliance systems must be risk-based. It's not about tick box. It's not about just buying something off the shelf. It's about risk, being risk-based. You can't do everything. You can't look at every single account every year. You have to take a risk-based approach to certain things. And as a result of that, the Capital Accord calls for risk measurements on credit risk, market risk, operational risk, and in recent time, liquidity risk. After the big collapse, operational risk. Liquidity risk. They have now liquidity buffers. Where would compliance risk falls in the scheme of those things? Anybody? Huh? Which one? Shout it out, man. You can't be wrong inside here. Operational risk. So compliance risk would fall right here, right? And therefore, as you see, the compliance function is really an important part and parcel of the risk management process. So risk-based regulation dictates that professionals with responsibility for compliance management and system design or regulatory relations understands risk management. In order to get this compliance thing right, you must understand risk management. All of you who may act as compliance officer, MLROs, so on, you're doing exactly that. You're doing risk management. A lot of time where the challenge comes is that you doing the what, but sometimes do not appreciate the why. And when you start to appreciate the why, the how becomes that much easier. If we know exactly where we're going, we eliminate many other roads, don't we? So getting there is important in understanding the why. It's very, very important that we do that. Okay. We can spend some time talking about this. What is a risk? Need to be interactive. Not a lot of responses, but we need one or two. What is a risk? Or what is risk? Anybody? We got a lot to do, so we got to go quick. What is a risk?
Taking a chance.
Huh?
Taking a chance.
Taking a chance. So some probability in there, right? What's risk? Okay, let me ask this. This is one of my favorite scenarios. What's the risk of walking over to the pool is that way, jumping in there and getting wet? What's the risk? Huh? 100% risk. Okay. No, somebody said no. Who's that? What's the risk? Huh? It's
probably because you can walk around and
No. Jumping in the water. What's the risk of getting wet? Zero.
When you look at risk, is really the probability that something other than the expected outcome will occur. So,
Okay.
I mean, you expect to get wet if you jump in the water.
Okay. So, Eureka moment. There's absolutely no risk of jumping in the pool and getting wet. None. It's a certainty. It's a certainty that you will get wet. Absolutely no risk. Okay. assuming that water is in the pool. That's what she said. So now we're starting to warm to the idea that if it's certain, you can deal with it. If you don't want to get wet, what would you not do? Not jump in the pool. But if you wanted to get kind of wet, what would you do? Bring your? You wet your feet. And if you don't want all of your clothes to be wet, what would you do? You take them off and you put on your trunks, right? So you know exactly what will happen. So the issue is you should be focusing on the uncertainty. So it says here that risk is the uncertainty that is inherent in a range of possible outcomes which occur as a result of the choices or decision acquired throughout an extended enterprise. Okay? Uncertain outcome, we don't know what's going to happen, and it's a range of possibility. So, risk is not necessarily a bad thing. They're good risks. For those of you who trade the stock exchange, if you do, maybe you have some Microsoft shares, there is a risk that Microsoft shares will increase today. Is that a bad thing?
No.
Maybe there's uncertainty too. It may reduce, right? So, at the end of the day, the way you understand and define these things are important, right? It's not necessarily good or bad, right? But there's some things which are absolutely bad. Like if you were driving here this morning and you hit your car, right? Is there any good thing coming out of that? No. No, absolutely. So you have different classes of risk. That would be referred to as a pure risk. Absolutely pure. And this is a case where the only outcome in a pure risk is something which is negative. Then you have speculative risk like buying Microsoft shares where it could go up or down and you get value. So that's the understanding. So what is it about risk and compliance which I need to be concerned about? The government of Timbuktu just changed its laws and says nobody can do business outside the country. Is there anybody inside here who's concerned? By show of hands. How many clients you have from Timbuktu? Okay, let me wind that back. You just become aware that the government of Timbuktu is debating the laws to change an act which will say nobody can do business outside of Timbuktu. It's uncertain whether it's going to pass or not. True? Because, it's law. Opposition in there. Is there anybody concerned? You know why? Because that doesn't impact your objective. If there is no connection between the uncertain event and your objective, what do? You pass it on. It doesn't matter to you. Is it raining in the Bahamas? Is there a risk that it may rain in the Bahamas? Do you care? Absolutely not. But if you're going back to the Bahamas this afternoon, do you care? Yes. Exactly the point I'm making. Your objective makes the risk becomes important. So risk is a function, or there is a correlation, or if you want to look at it a different way, there are dimensions of risk. And two dimensions is uncertainty. Can't spell it right, I use spell check a lot. Uncertainty and objective. Okay, so we can build on that. What is risk management? It's the mechanism that creates stability in the organization by enabling identification, prioritization, mitigation, and measurement of the implication of each decision. Right? So your decision to go to the Bahamas this afternoon will have implication if you pick up the news and you start reading about the weather. Because now you need to say, well, no, I can't wear that shoe, I need to wear a bootie, that sort of thing, right? So it's important that we understand exactly why some risks are important and why some are not. Because when we come to the next level of discussion, you will see where it all falls in. Not every risk is important to you. If it doesn't impact your objective, what are you worrying about it for? If it impacts your objective, then certainly you will have to take a look at that. Then you have the whole issue of internal control. And here is where I say the rubber meets the road. A lot of persons talk about risk management. But what exactly is risk management? How does it work? It's not some esoteric definition out there. It's not something that you don't know. Let me pick on somebody. Gotta pick on somebody. Man sitting like Atlas, thinking of the world. You live not too far from here because I understand no place is far here, right? Were you the last person to leave your house this morning?
No, first.
You're the first. If you were the last person to leave your house this morning, what would you do?
I locked the door.
You probably lock the door. Good. I was getting to that. I'm glad you said that. What's a door?
Prevents risk from somebody going in the house.
Prevents persons going inside, right?
Yeah.
It also prevents people from coming out. Couldn't it?
They can unlock from the inside.
No. I mean, it could prevent somebody from coming out if they don't have a key, right?
Coming out?
Yes?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Okay, hold that thought. If you would walk outside and leave the door unlocked, right? Do you still have a door?
Yes.
You still have a door. So let's say the door is our internal control. Do we have it? Do we have it? How does it become effective? No. When we lock it, right? So, you have over here internal control, right? It's a process effected by an entity, board of directors, management and other persons, designed to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of your objective. What's the objective of locking your door?
Reduce risk.
Stop people from going inside. So, in order for that to work, you need to apply the lock, right? Don't you also lock your door as a mechanism of keeping you safe when you're inside?
Yes.
Do you understand or do you appreciate the fact that doors and windows are some of the weakest part of a house? Yes. You do? Yes. So the perfect house is one without doors or windows, isn't it? You gotta work with me here. The perfect house, the safest house is the one without doors or windows. True? No. But if it has no doors or windows, right, you wouldn't be able to get in. So if you want to build that perfect house, then the best place to do that is to stay inside and build it, right? Without doors or windows. What would you get? You get a grave, right? The point I'm making here is simply this. You have to look at the effectiveness and the efficiency of the control. You can have the control on one hand, but it may not be effective. An unclosed door is not effective, right? A house without doors or windows is not efficient. It doesn't provide for comfortable living. If you are inside when that's built, that's going to be your pyramid. A couple of thousand years from now, they'll be looking at you and saying, "Rah, that's right inside." You'll be all wrapped up. You won't be coming out, right? So, compliance deals with what? Compliance with applicable laws and regulations. That's what a compliance function is about. So, we made the point that risk management, right? Risk management is about helping you to better meet your objectives. Yeah? And the objective of compliance is simply this: to ensure that you comply with all the relevant laws and regulations. What am I trying to do here? I'm trying to demystify this whole idea that risk management is something that none of us can understand. If we are stepping outside right now, like the last time we were here, and Sunday was coming, there would be a lot of rain, right? Most of you who were here the last time, or some of you, you would have walked inside here with what? Huh? An umbrella. So if you think about the risk as the rain, right? Your risk management mechanism is simply that. The umbrella. Subject to how well you hold it and whether the breeze gets high and stuff may determine whether it's effective or not, or whether it's efficient. If somebody like Miguel took out one of those, young ladies' umbrella, the very small one, you won't help him. You'll have parts protruding, so you get wet. It's not effective, right? But it's a control nonetheless. So all of this comes together, tells you that risk management risk is about dealing with the uncertainty. Risk management is how you mitigate that, yeah? And the way you implement it, obviously, is through what? The internal controls. And that's where we need to look at. What is it that you have been doing? You have had checklists. You have policies and procedures, right? You do KYC. Those are the controls that you have in place. Only checks will not go to the company unless two persons sign off on that. That's a control. You have an A and a B. That's a control. The question is how effective these are. And once you start asking yourself that, once you start understanding how that works, then you're well on your way to getting this risk management thing down. So what are the various categories? Broadly speaking, you have financial risk, and we'll show you that in a more granular form later. Operational risk, and if you notice, we're breaking out compliance risk there. Compliance risk primarily relates to the risks and activities that impact adherence to applicable laws and regulations, all right? And then you have your strategic risk. Very important, because strategic risk usually says what's the objective of the organization. So, primarily related to the risks and activities that impact the achievement of the organization business objectives. Remember we said earlier, you have to tie the risk to your objective. What is it that you're trying to achieve? And once you're trying to achieve that, then you can say, okay, this is going to stop me from doing it. So, in a nutshell, these are kind of a range of risks you have. And I've highlighted in red the ones which are usually more closely tied to the compliance function. And these would be legal, compliance, and regulatory. Regulatory because the FSC is going to come and get you sooner or later if you don't do this. That's true. I read the legislation online, and it's a very interesting legislation. I've discovered a new form of punctuation. After every section, there's a dollar amount at the end. And that dollar amount doesn't go under 25,000. And then when you get to the back, there's another schedule there with the smaller amounts, like the 2005 and stuff. But the big ones, $50,000 if you don't send a report in. $25,000, they will get you if you don't do what you're supposed to do. So there is regulatory risk. The risk that you do not comply with what the FSC imposes on you through the legislation, the ordinance, or whatever else they have there. And you have legal risk, which is the risk that you may be sued, the risk that you're going to suffer some sort of legal loss. And compliance is the risk that you actually don't comply with the rules and regulations, which you should, of course, which is tied to that. Because once you fail here, then in rides the regulators, because it's important that the financial system is safe and sound. Because there's this whole issue of systemic risk. We won't get into that, but you have the systemic risk is simply or easily defined as this: one bad apple. Exactly. So that's what you have. One bad company, it knocks on, it creates problem for the jurisdiction, reputational damage, and so on and so forth. So let me ask you now, if we were to stop here, would you be able to effectively manage risk? Yes? My good friend, shaking his head. We're going to have a lot of fun later. Would you? All right. Write these down if you would, but I'm going to say in about 6 questions. You ask yourself about 6 questions. And you see how it ties to what we've been saying before. When you start thinking about risk management, ask yourself these questions. 1, what is my objectives? 2, what are the things which could stop me from meeting my objective? Sorry, let me roll that back. Are there things which could stop me from meeting my objective? Yeah? You get that? So what are my objectives? Are there things which could stop me from meeting my objective? Thirdly, what are they? Are there things? Yes, there are things out there which could stop me. What exactly are these things? Fourthly, which are the important ones? The important one is pretty much this. Rain can stop me from meeting my objective, but is the rain in Turks and Caicos or is it in the Bahamas? The difference becomes important. Then, I'm at 4, right? I'm at 4? Now, the 5th one, right? How do I evaluate them? How do I evaluate them? How do I evaluate them? And lastly, is there any indication of them being, no. How do I treat them? Treat, you can write treat and underline it because we're going to come back to that word. How do I treat it? And is there any possibility of them recurring? Do I know whether they will recur? If you think about risk management in those terms, right, then you link in exactly what we've talked about up to this point. You have identified that objective is important, true? You have identified the fact that there's uncertainty, so there's risk out there, but not all risks are important for you. That's what the third question says, right? True? You also understand that you need to evaluate them. Because they're not all important, you need a basis on which to evaluate them. You need to determine how you're going to treat them. And you need to determine whether or not they are recurring. So you're going to get into monitoring them. This I put there, we're not going to get too much into it. But the point I want to make here is simply this. We have some financial controls around here. We have some credit risk issue here, some treasury risk, insurance, and so on and so forth. All of these are color coded, so that's blue is financial risk, that's operational, your blue here, other blue, which is not showing up too well, and then that which is coming out as this would be your strategic risk. The idea here is, which I want you to understand, is that risk does not operate in a vacuum. So when you identify the 10 or so issues which relate to you, I'll get that. Bear in mind that a lot of things are coming out there from the universe, all right? It is about enterprise risk management. You cannot manage risk on a silo basis. So compliance risk, yes, you're a compliance officer. But what exactly is happening over there in the legal department? What exactly is happening over there in lending? All of these things impact you. Take, for example, one guy is lending to a very politically exposed individual, right? Let's assume that you're a big institution. But that isn't credit, right? It's not your business. You sit over here and you have your nice manual, you have your nice politically exposed document and who falls into these groupings, and you know how to identify them. But nobody bothers to check out the guy over there. And then what? He doesn't pay his loan, right? Because he don't pay the loan, and because he's an important guy, he's politically exposed, it filters into the newspaper. And you have a discussion. What starts to happen? What sort of risk we're dealing with now? Huh? What sort of risk we're dealing with? Reputational risk. So the point here is that all things are interconnected. How many of you play dominoes? Anybody? In Turks and Caicos, no? Everybody play dominoes. Have you ever been with a set of dominoes by yourself? No? Stand them up, knock them down. You've done that. Or at least you have seen it someplace, right? That's exactly how risk works. The first risk or the first issue is a trigger, right? And it just has this knock-on effect. And it goes and goes and goes. If you do absolutely nothing, the last domino will fall. But of course you can go inside there before you get to that point and pluck out a couple, right? And the last one will fall and that will be the end of it. So you have to bear that in mind. Like for example, a compliance issue may start the problem, but it's a liquidity issue which is going to end it at the end of the day. And by liquidity is when you do not have sufficient money to pay your suppliers, and when people stop doing business with you, ultimately, that's what's going to end your company. All right, so let's look at how we do this. And bear in mind those 6 questions I raised before. The approach to risk management. So the first thing you need to do is you need to identify your risks. Yeah? So what are the key threats and opportunities that might affect my business? What may affect the objective I've set for myself? You with me? Risk assessment. We're going to take the risk, we're going to turn it over, and we're going to understand what it represents. Is it a big risk? Is it an important one? What would the impact be? Is it something that we can discard? And the assessment is important. Why is the assessment important? Because it determines how you treat the risk. So you have your risk assessment. It says how does the potential impact relate to our risk tolerance or risk appetite? What's your risk appetite? You're a company with lots of capital and you have the ability to take on lots of risk, or you're a small 2-man show which can't afford to make huge losses. What's your attitude towards risk? Is it a company which goes after risky business, or do you pull back? Are you in an institution which is risk averse, and nothing is wrong with that? Are you risk takers, or are you risk neutral? Right? You just say, as being risk neutral, things are going to happen. Right? It doesn't matter. I'll just go on with my business. I don't think that's a good position to be, but that's how some persons are. If it happened, it happened. we won't manage it any at all. So you're risk neutral, you're risk averse, or you're risk taker. So you need to then look at your prioritization. What are the most critical issues that demand your immediate attention? How do they relate to the business strategy, and what are your options? Why is that important? It's absolutely impossible for you to pay attention in sufficient details to every single issue impacting your business. It just won't happen. So you have to decide which is more important, all right? Is it, are we going to worry about something which occurs which is going to cost us $500 every 2 months? Or something which, if occur, is going to cost us $500,000? Which one is more important? So prioritization is very, very important, and you have to look at what your options are. Then you ask yourself some questions. What do I do with these risks? Do I avoid, transfer, or retain the risk? Let me say this here. We talked about risk avoidance, right? Risk avoidance and risk retention are important parts of treating risk. You may say, okay, this guy don't like to take risks, any at all, so everything comes, he runs away from that. That's not what we're talking about. You have done your assessment. You have determined that this particular piece of business, I am not getting into that. It is a viable means of risk management, right? You decide that, look, while I can make $1 million, there's a downside and I may lose 500,000. I'm not willing to take that risk. I'm going to avoid it. So it's a viable approach. Transfer. How many of you transfer risk? How many of you transfer risk in your business? By a show of hands, quickly. You do. How you do that? Insurance. Insurance. What you have done is taken ownership for the risk, and you have transferred it to a third party for a cost. But look what's happening in insurance. Two things happen usually when you use insurance. That and that. Retain and transfer. How do you retain insurance? How do you retain the risk when you buy insurance? Huh? There's a deductible. There is a deductible. And it says for the first $5,000, that's on you. We could take it, but your premium going to be a bit higher. You see, it's a risk-reward trade-off. You're saying, I can manage $5,000 if this did happen. But the additional $500,000, $495,000, I can't manage that. So I'm going to transfer that to another party. And that party is going to take a fee from me. And why would the guy buy your risk? Well, he looks at it and says, if I buy a risk from everybody inside here, what's the risk of all of them having the same event at the same time? Some sort of catastrophic stuff. And you use the principle of large numbers, and you have this normal distribution type thing happening there. All things being equal, all of us not going to have the same event at the same time. So we'll have sufficient monies to pay you out when your event takes place, because we're working with large numbers. But the insurance man is not even simply stopping at that. What he does is he reinsures. Risk management. Yeah? Okay. So then you have your action. What's the best course of action to take? And then you have ongoing monitoring. The last question I ask you, is there repeat? How do you know that this risk that you have put controls in place is working? How do you know, how do you know that the controls are working effectively? Is the risk thing popping up again at a level which is not tolerable? How do you know that? You have to monitor. You have to review. And that's where that process comes in. So the purpose of risk assessment is to identify and analyze the risk areas for the business so you can prioritize these for the organization and management can address them. We talked about that already. The risk assessment can be entity-wide, so you have to look at it on a holistic basis. You also need to look at it at the activity level, what's happening there. And then you also can look at it at project level. But that information is provided in your handout so that you can have a more casual read. That's exactly what we just talked about. All right. So now we need to shift gears a little bit. We talk about risk. We talk about the process, right? Let's now talk about the risk management cycle itself and how does it work in real time. Here is just a graphical representation of a lot of things we talked about earlier. So the first phase is your risk analysis, which includes your assessment, identification, and you look at your probability of outcome, likelihood, and impact. All right? Then you have your control design. You make the house, and you know that you want to keep persons out, but you also want to get out yourself. So you go into control design strategy. I need to create a house which has openings, right, which can let us out, let us in, and also for the purpose of here to come in and here to go out, right? So that's your overall strategy, isn't it? Never think about it like that, right? But that's your overall strategy. So what then do you do? The first person who built the house actually came up with this smart thing. Why don't I put doors and windows in? Yeah? So now that's control design. And as you know, you can have doors like that, which is not as safe as some would wish it to be, right? You can have big plant doors like back in medieval days, right? When you know there's a lot of guys who come knocking. So those are big doors, this thick, running pulleys and stuff. So the control design is important. Coming back to your question, sir, is that the complexity, the size of the organization, the type of business you're doing determines what type of door you build. If you're in a fancy resort with security and all this other stuff, fine, put up a glass window, door, French door. That's fine, nobody's going to knock it down. But if you were King George I, where lots of people come knocking at your door and they're not necessarily your friends, right? You not only put up a door, you have a moat with funny things inside there, right? And boiling oil to drop on them just in case they need a little bit of blessing, all right? So that's your control design. And then you implement it. You put the door in. But you don't just stop there. You put a locking mechanism on the door, don't you? And you need to come back and check from time to time that when all the children are gone to bed, you walk through the house, and you make sure that all the doors are locked. What are you checking for? Security, for the effectiveness of your control. You monitor it. And when they do not lock the door from time to time, what do? You admonish them. You say you got to be careful, right? You got to know that the crazy people out there, you can't just leave the door open. That's what you're doing. That's part and parcel of the risk management process. I break it down like that, put it in terms which you already understand. I guarantee you know this, right? This is no fancy thing. You know that it's about the way you think about it and the way you apply it in a very practical way. All right? So, the question therefore to ask is, how do I identify these risks? Easy. Very easy. When you want to identify risks, you go and you ask the persons who is directly related to first. One of the biggest mistakes is asking persons who you think are smart, right? You ask the people on the board, you ask senior management. When you want to know about security risk, you ask the security officer. You tell him, stay here and don't move, right? But he knows that somebody jumping over the wall there. He sees them every single time. But because you tell him don't move, he's not moving. The rest of the wall is too low. So how do you do that? By interviews. So you interview the people. You have questionnaires. Brainstorm. We sit inside it. Let's say we were doing risk management on this room. Right? So let's brainstorm. What are some of the risks in this room right now? Look around. What's some of the risks in this room?
Electricity.
Electricity. Go ahead. What? Doors. What are some of the risks to us? I don't want to get nobody scared, right? I really don't want to get nobody scared. But I'm walking out of this one very fast. It is a risk. I don't think it went far, but I'm not certain. So we brainstormed, we talked about it. Nobody have to move from this seat, really. Right? We talked about what could go wrong, right? I could walk over this and I could trip. It's simple things sometimes. And the idea is not to take anything off the table until the appropriate time. And you will see what we're talking about. So we brainstorm, we do self-assessment, so we complete workshop, we have tabletop discussions where we all come together in a room and we sit down and we talk about the processes. How this work, how it work, what could go wrong, right? We building something, what could go wrong? Could it blow? Could it not break down? Could this piece drop off? That's all the thing, right? We do SWOT analysis. Everybody knows about this, right? The history of risk. We know that in this type of business, these things have happened before, all right? Businesses have failed. We have compliance issues. We see them in the news all the time. So you use that. Because one thing about history is our way of repeating itself. You have audit and inspection reports. So when your auditors come in, that's a basis for identifying your risk. They come up with problems. They give you reports. When your regulators come in, you get reports of stuff which is going wrong. Those are sources of identification. External source. Compare it with other organizations. What is it that they're doing right? All right? So one of the best way sometimes of getting that is you look over there and you say, okay, that's a good company, they're doing everything right. Why they're doing everything right? Well, we don't know. We just going to employ the compliance officer who used to work over there. And when they come in, bring the manuals and stuff too. They may not be able to do that, but what they will come is a lot of knowledge in their head, right? Or you guys meet for dinner. You guys meet for lunch. You have groups. You have association. You sit around and you talk about the problems of the industry. You compare yourself with each other. Discussion with peers. You benchmark. You benchmark the best practice. Or you bring in risk consultants. People like me. I'm a risk consultant? Yes, I am. You bring in people like me. And you say, help me work through this. You talk about stuff. Over here is, we're not going to get too much into this, but you have a checklist flow charts. Your value chain analysis is where you look at each step in delivering whatever it is that you deliver. So if you're into Chris money transfer, right? You have the guy walks in, he needs to give you the money, then you have to send it to through the system, then it has to get picked up someplace, right? All of those are parts of the value chain which creates value for the ultimate customer. And then you can go in that and dissect in each stage and find out what some of these risks are. You look at your business processes, system engineering and process mapping. I would say don't get too much into this area, but those get a little bit complicated. Yes,
Just tell me what SWOT analysis is again.
the SWOT analysis. SWOT means strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. All right? So what you do is, again, we come together and we ask the question, what is the strength of our business? What is it that we do well? All right? What are the things that we don't do well? And that's our weaknesses. One of the things, let me break this SWOT since you asked the question. Just in case anybody else has a similar concept. SWOT should be broken down into two. That's external, and this is internal. Strengths and weaknesses is what exists in your organization, internal. Your opportunities and threats, usually things which are external. Sometimes you'll find opportunities and threats inside, but for the most part, it's the competitor who's going to get you. The opportunity is the change in the legislation. All right, see, almost falling out of the change in the legislation, right? While you're saying, man, what FSC doing again? Why they're changing that? It may be a risk to your current business, but in that could lie an opportunity because you could change your business model. you recognize that first and you open that everybody has cried out the threat. And you make the adjustment and it gives you some competitive advantage. So your SWOT analysis can help you in that regard. Strength, opportunities, weaknesses, and threats. Yes, sir.
I'm not quite sure that you've sort of dismissed the value chain analysis so quickly because
Oh no, I'm
surely
not
the point is at the very beginning,
Yeah.
if you don't know what your objective is,
Yeah.
because that's dropped off the conversation now, if you're not sure what the objectives are, you're not going to know what's going to go wrong because you're not knowing where you're going to head for.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to my mind, looking at the value chain as you describe it is step by step you can see what you're trying to achieve.
I agree. I agree. I'm not dismissing it, and that's why I picked out that one and went through the whole issue of the money transfer business. I'm saying that these tend to get a little bit more complicated, so I'm not trying to get over everybody's head. But you're right. It's about almost backward engineering your business. You have to understand what goes into each step, right? So you take the water. Is it removes osmosis? Did it come from a spring? The plastic that goes into that. Each step there is value added. You go to the restaurant. You go to the restaurant and you buy, you pull out the menu and the menu say, mai. Right? You like mai, blackened or some other way. But what goes into that? A fisherman had to go out and catch that, right? So that's one level of the value chain. Then they sell that to somebody else who processes it. Then they get it to the hotel. The hotel have to store that, do whatever else, and then they get it into the kitchen and the cook goes to work. So there's value chain along the way. Just the same as if you're selling a piece of business, a piece of trust business. There's value chain. Somebody has to go out and do the business. Somebody has to go prospect. Then the business needs to come in and the compliance officer has to look at it, right? You have to decide it's a good piece of business. Well, no, it's a good person to do business with. Then you have to consider whether or not you're going to make money from this. And then you got to consider how you're going to manage it. And then you have the ongoing processes. So definitely don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying dismiss any of these. But I'm saying that some of these are, you come with system engineering, process mapping. Some of these are a little bit complicated. Certainly value chain analysis. Scenario analysis is pretty straightforward. You can use your flow charts.
You could look at it more simply and say, use your analogy with a restaurant. If you own a restaurant, you've got one or two objectives, haven't you? Which is right. I want to serve my customers within 20 minutes.
Fresh meat.
So what do I have to do?
Exactly.
And what might go wrong? The chef doesn't turn up, or you get too busy, or whatever. But without having clear in your mind where your objective is, it's very difficult to sit there and say, well, what might go wrong? Because you don't know what you want.
Objectives are always important. Just to take your point a little bit further, if you pride your restaurant as serving fresh fish, so from fisherman to plate, right? You don't buy from a distributor. What you have is a cook, which is very eccentric, and he goes down to the seaside each day, and he buys a fish straight from him, and he brings it in. So they cut out the thing from the different steps which takes place. But I do take your point. So we need to look carefully at all of those things. All right. Let's go. Okay. When you start to look at these risks, what are you going to do with them? You create a what? I can't hear you. You create a risk register. You write them down. I'm sorry, it's very small. You can't really see that, but you get the idea, right? The idea is that you found risk from 1 to 40. Obviously, there's not all of them there, right? And you decide that in the case of this one, I'm looking for one. I know there's one there for compliance. But let's take this. Say, exceed accepted tolerance risk. It's operational, so you determine what category of risk is. It exceeds regulatory or strategic threshold. And that says incorrect or missing data, files are not updated. So basically you create this.
Do you have a bigger typeface? I can't read anything.
Okay. No, we don't have a bigger time, but I can get you the source document, which come from, where that come from? Right? I'll get you the document. It's actually from a document. Just let me get you the information. I'll email it to you. Sorry about that. But the idea is, I really don't want you to get into what's written there because, that's an example. What I want you to get into is the fact that we are putting together a register and then we're coming up with some sort of grading, right? These are the kind of yellows, the brighter ones, and so on. So you create this register because you need to know what all of the risks you've decided. And why you need to do that? Because at some point in time you'll have to come back again and you have to determine whether all of this 1 to 40 is important. Because who's going to sit down every day and manage these 40 risks? Right? Some of these things we are going to touch once a year, once in 5 years, and some of them we're going to have to touch every single day, maybe, depending on the importance there. So that's what the takeaway from that really is, not so much to focus on what's written there. So, okay, so how do we evaluate these risks? This is a simple model which looks at two things: the impact of the risk and the likelihood of the risk outcome. So the impact of the risk, so let's use $sign. The likelihood that it would happen, let's use probability. All right? So let's say, let's go back to real world stuff. Turks and Caicos is similar to the Bahamas. What's the probability of you having a earthquake in Turks and Caicos? For those of you who did a little bit of geology in school, what's the probability of having an earthquake?
Earthquake.
It's never none. It's never none. Low, right? So we would say, because we have a business and we have buildings, right? We're in the business of protecting those, so we want to consider it, because here's where we're going to determine what sort of insurance we need, right? So we say the likelihood is low. But if we did have an earthquake, what would be the potential impact? High. So we have a medium exposure, or somewhere there, right? Or, depending on the measure of the earthquake, it could be catastrophic, right? And so you may decide that, look, I am going to buy insurance to cover that. Unfortunately, maybe the insurance man is not going to sell you insurance, because if you have an earthquake in a small area, small country like this, which is so concentrated, what's the likelihood that it's going to happen? That too many persons are going to be impacted. So you could buy insurance and somebody would sell you, right? But chances are, for insurance of your house with value $1 million, your premium may be $1 million. Don't worry, right? So the idea here, therefore, is you want to determine where the risk falls so that you can apply the necessary risk treatment. So for example, if you had a risk item which falls here, very, very high, almost to catastrophic, what would you do? What would be the risk treatment?
Self-insured?
Self-insure? No. Self-insure is going to be here, because self-insurance is acceptance, right? And you see that when we come to some other slides, right? Here is either you are going to transfer or avoid, and it's likely that avoidance would be the area here. It's way too
But
much.
if your risk appetite is for high risk business, that's exactly where you should be.
Right here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because you would say the reward, potential reward, presumably, is high.
You see, you made a very important point. The point here is that you are going to stay here because that's your risk appetite. I am going to run because my risk appetite does not tolerate that. So again, it's not one size fits all. You have to look at your appetite, you have to look at your objectives. There you go. All right. And this slide just kind of gives you a definition of likelihood. This would be another way of looking at it. This would be unlikely low, likely medium, certain or imminent would be high. The risk is seen as unlikely to occur within the time horizon contemplated by the objective. Time is important. If you have a project which is, I guess, over a 3-year period, but you have analyzed and said there's a possibility that in the 5th year something is going to happen. What does it bother you? It's outside your time horizon. If it's outside the time horizon, then it doesn't become that important anymore. But once it's inside there, once it's within the time horizon, then you really have to look at it. And here again, the impact you could use, critical, moderate, negligible. It's not likely to happen, right? So if it does, we're going to accept it, assuming that the impact is sufficiently low. If it's critical, the risk will cause the objective not to be achieved, causing damage to the organization or reputation. What would you do then? You're likely to not get into that business, right? This is just another example of how you could do the same thing. See, the classifications are not written in stone. You can come up with different ways of doing this, right? So here they use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, insignificant, minor, moderate, major, catastrophic. Rare, not likely to happen. Unlikely, it's possible, it's likely, it's almost certain. If the impact is going to be catastrophic, and it's almost certain to happen, you're not going to do that. So if you notice, almost certain is more along the red areas, right? And then you have a nice strip coming through here, which is your medium risk, where it's possible, moderate. If it's getting major, here's your high risk, all right? So that's one way of looking at it. That's a little bit more wider than the first model we looked at. We look at another one, very simple and straightforward. Is it likely to happen once a week, once every fortnight, once per month, once a quarter, once a year, between 1 and 5 years, over 5 years? Again, this gives you an idea of what will happen within the time horizon, right? Once a week, you determine whether that would be fatal. Once a fortnight, that's major. Once a month, that's critical. Once a quarter, that's high. Once a year, moderate. Low. 5 years is insignificant. And you go on and you make your assessment like that. This is another approach of doing sin. All right? But let's get to the meat of the matter. Now that we understand that, 1, we identify the risk, and 2, we have different treatments on everything. And 2, we have the various treatments. Let's see how it is that we manage this whole process. Low, medium, high, low, medium, high. Okay. Give me an example of a risk we can talk about. So, huh? Say? Getting burned from hot coffee. Oh, all right. Getting burned from hot coffee. The risk is being burned, right? So you have a cup of hot coffee, right? How likely is that to burn you? You have a cup of very, very hot coffee. What's the likelihood that if it gets on your hand, it will burn you? High. Good. Right. All right, let's flip that a different way. You are Starbucks. All right? You're Starbucks. You serve hot coffee. The risk of your coffee burning somebody is high. Yeah? What's the likelihood of that happening? Most of the time, it don't. Kind of like moderate, right? But if it did happen, what would take place? They would sue you, and the impact could be $1 million. So that's what you want to say is high? Okay, good. So that's the starting point. Now, how do we deal with that? We have a couple of options. We could say, let's come out of business, let's get out of business, right? And not sell hot coffee. But that's what we do. We discontinue the activity which causes certain risk when the returns are not attractive in comparison with the risk we face. Starbucks makes oodles of money selling hot coffee. So would they get out of business? Are the returns attractive?
Yes.
They are attractive, yeah? So they are not going to get out of that business, would they? So avoidance is not an option here. Okay, so if you don't want to avoid it, what are your next options? Right? We could reduce the risk, right? How do we reduce the risk? By putting a lid on the cup, by using special types of cups, and by putting a message on the cup which says hot will burn. Yeah, that's what your cup is saying, right? I don't drink it, but I've seen the cups. What are they doing? They're doing risk reduction. So it's preventative measures to reduce the likelihood of the risk and corrective measures to reduce the impact. Establishing operational limits, establishing control activities. The cup, the special type of cup is control activity, yeah? The lid on the cup, even though when you sip through that part, it will burn your tongue still, right? But the possibility of all of that spilling out on you is reduced. So they're reducing the risk, all right? But all things being equal, somebody's going to get burned. True? Somebody is going to get burned at some point in time. So what do you do then? Because if that person gets burned and they sue you, it could go into millions of dollars. And that could have an impact on your business. It could disrupt your business, right? Assuming you're not really Starbucks, $1 million won't do them anything. But $1 million to most of us would wipe us out, right? Wipe me out, for sure. You want that. So you want to then transfer that risk to a third party. And the typical one is insurance company. The other mechanisms of doing that, if you were in financial management, you could get into hedging. You could use derivatives and all that sort of stuff. But we're not going to talk about that today. So insurance is the easiest mechanism of transferring that risk. So just in case you are sued, right, and you lose, then the insurance company then rolls in and pays that money out for a premium. And the other approach is, and this is your last risk treatment, you could accept the risk. All right? What the insurance company will say to you is, if somebody gets burned and sue you, and when you go to court, the charge, the fine, the damages is $1 million, right? I will pay. But you are going to accept the first $200,000. So I'm only going to be responsible for $800,000. All right? So you would then say to the insurance company, okay, if that's the case, then I will handle all of the low claims, right? So if somebody comes in, I have a small burn, went to the doctor, just a little thing, so the doctor bill, little time off, maybe $5,000, $10,000, Starbucks would pay that. What are they doing? They're accepting the risk. But here's what is really happening in graphical terms. We started here, all right? When you come to avoidance, it's just off the table, right? So avoidance is, we're not doing it. Done. Nothing else to worry about. We just out of the business. We're not going to sell coffee because too many people are going to get burned and the amount of money we're making is not sufficient to justify that. All right? Or we can transfer the risk. Now, when you transfer the risk, right, is the likelihood going to change? No. What are you changing? Huh? You're passing it on. So you're changing the impact. So what you're doing is you're reducing your impact to, you're reducing the impact to low. Guy get burned, costs $1 million. Where the $1 million come from? Insurance. All you're doing is paying periodic premium, right? So you reduce the impact. Now move it from high to low. You can change the probability. Over here, when you have a risk reduction opportunity, right? You could say, okay, the probability of this happening is medium. This is probability of, and this is our impact. All right? So the probability of it happening is medium. But if we serve it in special cups and put the lids on the cups, right? Then what we can do is to change the probability from a medium to a low. So the impact is still the same if it happens, right? But we reduce the possibility of it happening. That's risk reduction. We put it in controls, we transfer that. You have other options too. You could say, look, that's a reduction there. Take, for example, let's assume that this was a fire risk, yeah? For the building here. The fire happens, and we put in, what do you call it? Sprinklers. It reduces the possibility or the probability of the whole building being burned down, right? And it would also reduce the impact. So we could change that from maybe there and bring it here, yeah? Reduce the probability and also reduce the impact. The building will catch fire nonetheless, right? But if it did catch fire, the probability of us suffering a catastrophic loss is reduced so the impact is down, right? And the probability of total loss, right, is now reduced as medium there. So that's what they're saying here, that you take risk reduction, so you either reduce the likelihood, right, or you reduce the impact. That way, or that way. Here is a risk which we start out with, right? Once we have done our analysis, we have decided that this risk, the impact is low, and the likelihood is maybe medium right there. And we say, we are going to accept that. This is going to cost us maybe $500 every 6 months or so, so we accept that. So these here, these four here, are four risk treatments which we do. And this happens in your business every single time. As a compliance officer, when you go to your KYC and you say, this individual doesn't fit our KYC profile, what are you doing? You're rejecting him, right? You're avoiding that business. But this one, who is very similar, I'm going to take him and I'm going to classify him as high risk. You have now accepted that risk. And once you accept the risk, you say, well, here are some things which I'm going to do to manage that high risk. He's going to be reviewed annually or quarterly, right? He's going to have to go through enhanced due diligence, yeah? These are treatments that you do, and you're therefore reducing your risk. You decide that, look, my business is too big now, and I can no longer rely on manual system. So I go out and I get world check, all sorts of system with analytics which I can tag transaction, I can pull them together because I know an individual can come in my business because he knows the threshold. He says, okay, everything over $15,000 needs to be reported. All of my transactions are $12,000. You put a system in place which takes them, jam them together and say, I hit the car?
No.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's risk, that's operational risk right there. So, of all of the transactions which you are managing, transaction which is doing, he's now up to $500,000, but every single transaction was under the threshold, right? You are managing that, and that's exactly what is happening. So let's look at some of the benefits. We can wrap in a bit. So some of the benefits is improve strategic planning, improve your understanding of the business environment, dependent issues and the associated risks. You increase the success of achieving your business objective. This is the biggest thing here that we talked about earlier. You increase the possibility of you succeeding meeting your objective. You have clarification of critical functions. You improve the focus of resource on the highest risk. Those customers which are high risk, you assign to your most competent people, wouldn't you? You make sure that you throw huge amount of resources at them versus throwing resources at very low risk entities, which is not going to cause you any problem at all. Effective management program share a common set of critical success factors, demonstrate value, establish a clear mandate, encourage senior management commitment and management involvement. All of that needs to be in there. Clarify accountability, who's responsible, who owns the process. Integrate risk management into the organizational decision making. Leverage existing risk management efforts. So you may have risk management effort taking place on the corporate governance side, on the internal audit side, you may have some in legal, you may have some in loss prevention, and so on. All of these can come together, especially when it's not done in a siloed fashion, and that's important that ERM takes. So POP goes the ways. Then you have George Gilbert, and I want you to pay close attention to the names, right? There is a message in the names. George Gilbert is the chairman of the compliance committee, and Brady Henfield is the CFO. So they went to this big dinner. They call up some big people, big shots. So they went to this big dinner at Waters Edge Lodge, and they had dinner with this American, Rocky Waters. And they signed up a huge amount of Eastern European clients and didn't involve the compliance person at all. So a lot of things have gone wrong. And the board of directors decided, well, we need to have an emergency meeting. Because the building is flooded, they come to this hotel here. So they had this hotel in Grace Bay. And he's asking a very profound question, because some heads are going to roll now, right? He's asking, who exactly is responsible for this mess that we're in? And how is it that we're going to keep this quiet? You can't tell nobody. Over leans Megan, his sister, the compliance officer, and said to him, guess what, George? That would be you and the rest of the people on the board. And because Mr. Simons is in the room, it's no longer a secret. We have to tell the FSC. We can't keep it in the room. And then lastly, because we are the hotel manager made a big spread because it's a big important company. And because he was told that the executives were coming, and the board of directors was coming, and he did his count, you know that the board of directors have 9, and there are 7 executives. So he just automatically assumed that there's 16 persons coming to lunch. So he told the chef, and the chef went to work, good fancy spread, and then a bit of egg on his face. He had to rush just before and say, look, you're not really providing for 16 people, you only provided for 10 or so. Now, there's information in those numbers. So what we will do, we take a break here, right? Yeah. What we'll do is that we'll take a break here, we'll marinate on that case study a little bit. When we come back, we'll talk about some compliance issues, right? And then we'll have a short coming together. We want to create one or two groups here. And at the end of the day, we are going to apply, from a compliance perspective, our risk management processes that we learned earlier and throughout the rest of the other sessions to that simple case study. It's not hard, it's not an exam, it's not about you getting things wrong or right, and we are all here to guide each other. At the end it says, use your imagination. Throw things in there if you will, right? Don't be shy. So let's take a break here and let's come back
Right now it's for 10:25, so let's get back here at 10:40.
Thank you.
These chairs help.
You all right? Good, man. All right. Hey, Paul.
I did. I went through the session. Oh, almost. I got just this to do.
Okay. So we've completed one session. If you still have questions on that, keep them in mind. We still should have discussions on it. But I trust it's going okay so far? No? It's going fine. All right. Let's start this off with some fun now. For lunch at the region farm. For lunch at the region farm. Who can be the first person to tell me what these three letters mean? First person to tell me what these three letters mean, win lunch at the region farm today in a short while. No hints. GRC. What do you think GRC means? What? Risk compliance? Group risk compliance, she says. Yes.
Governance risk compliance.
Governance risk compliance. Go to the head of the class.
Pretty good.
Governance risk and compliance. You will get lunch today. Definitely. If you, and you have all the smartphones and stuff, right? If you Google that right now, a bunch of things will pop up. Why am I starting here? I'm starting here to let you know that what we're doing is part and parcel of the pool of knowledge out there. When you think about risk, which we have done so far, and compliance, which we're about to look at, right? Do not think about them in isolation. Governance, risk, and compliance are fundamentally attached at the hip. They're triplets. You can't unfold one from the other. An understanding of one requires you to understand the other. And so we've laid the basis this morning on what risk management is. And we are going to now delve into compliance. And you're going to see the commonality of the themes. You're going to see things happening again. And that's why the program has been designed this way, to make sure that we are consistently building one step to the next. So everybody hear about compliance, and I was told that we are interested here in understanding how to build an effective compliance program. True? And how to apply some of the principles of risk management and stuff. And this is what we're going to attempt to do right now. So let's start. What is the role of compliance? The expression compliance risk is defined as legal or regulatory sanctions, material financial losses, or loss to reputation a bank may suffer as a result of its failure to comply with laws, regulations, rules related to self-regulatory organization standards and code of conduct applicable to its banking activities. Together, compliance laws, rules, and standards. So the compliance function is an independent entity, or ought to be an independent entity. In many instances, persons set up compliance functions which are not independent. But it is one of maybe the only two independent functions which should be in every organization, and that's compliance and internal audit. Should be independent. You have to look at compliance from a holistic way. It's not just anti-money laundering, and it is a critical element of enterprise risk management and corporate governance. A lot of times, because of the way we emerge, we define ourselves. Like for most people in this room, if I ask you, who are you? Some may jump up and say, I'm an American. They say I'm Jamaican, I'm from Turks and Caicos, I'm a Belongna. That's all the thing, right? Compliance became popular around these parts because of what? Huh? 9/11, yeah. Terrorism, what else?
Money laundering.
Money laundering. And as a result of that, we a lot of times define compliance within the confines of terrorist financing, and money laundering, but it's more than that. If you read the definition says to comply with laws, regulations, rules. Even the company impose rules on itself. And that's part and parcel of the compliance function. So you have the laws, you have the regulations, you may be a part of an organization. Take, for example, you're, let's say, an accounting firm, right? You are part of the IFC or one of those international organizations. If compliance and accounting firms do have compliance officers these days, we have to take those rules into consideration. It can't simply be limited to the rules or the laws which has been imposed on you by the government or those which have been imposed on you by the regulator. It goes beyond that. All I'm trying to do here is to remove the barrier from your mind and asking you that when you think about compliance, do not think about it simply in terms of KYC, AML, or terrorist financing. It's wider than that. And because it's wider than that, tells you it has to be an important part of the risk management process. True? It's not simply just getting the KYC, AML thing down. So, before embarking on developing a compliance system, there are some things which we need to do. We need to consider internal and external factors. We need to think about the stakeholders. We need to think about the relationship which exists out there. So on an external basis, we need to consider the regulatory regime. What is it that's been imposed on you by your local regulator? And if you're a branch of an international organization, what's been imposed on you by the regulator of your parent company? So you have to consider the regulatory regime, the laws, and whatever principles are applicable. The program must be jurisdiction specific. Now let's say you started business in the Bahamas and you decide to move to Turks and Caicos. You can pick up your whole system, your manuals, your procedures, or you can come up here and you can open shop. And while the rules may be similar, and they are similar, they're not exactly the same. Bahamas is a sovereign country. Looks at things like a bit differently. The Turks and Caicos have some other persons who they need to take into consideration. There are some rules which go all the way to Westminster. All right? So you have to take that into consideration. So you have to bear in mind that your program needs to be jurisdiction specific. It needs to be respectful of the jurisdiction in which you operate. It's supposed to reflect the role and responsibility of the regulator. The regulator is going to come in and say, you must do this. These are the things I want you to do. So if your program is not respectful of that, if it's not reflecting what is required of the regulator, and the regulator operates within a scheme of international standards put out by Bank of International Settlement, right? There are rules out there which says the regulator must do this, the regulator should do this, the regulator must have this in place, the regulator must ensure that the licensee do these things. So your program has to dance to that tune. And importantly, you must consider international recognized bodies. So FATF, when they come up with things, we have to be responsive to them. Yes? They come up with 40 recommendations back in the days, and then they say that's not enough, we come up with a special 9. So just as you learn the 40 and you have this down pat, you have to come up with a special 9, and then they did what? They went back and they rejigged all of them, and they're not 40 plus 9 no more. I think there's about 41, right? They did some sort of curtailment. You have to consider an institution like the OECD. What are the big countries doing? When the US decides to impose or use its might to impose sanctions on some countries, what happens? When the OECD decide we're going to have this blacklisting because we're going to force persons because we think their practices is harmful to global taxation system, what do? So we have to be respectful of those. BIS, IOSCO, all those organizations. So in designing your program, you cannot do that within the context of a bubble. You have a big, wide, global situation which you must take into consideration. Internal. Here we go again. Nice fancy words which we used earlier. You need to consider the risk appetite of the entity. Is the entity a risk taker? Yep, risk taker. So that means your controls need to be more robust. They need to be more responsive to the type and the level of risk that you're willing to take. The nature and diversity of your operation. Are you operating in one country? Right? Multiple countries. Are you operating in one location? Multiple locations? Do you have 2 persons versus 100 persons? You come back to your point, sir. The size is not one size fits all. We have to be respectful of that. The complexity and scale of the business. It may not be that you have 100 employees, but it may be that the type of business you're doing is very complex. You may be in some sort of esoteric type of trust product, where you provide them, services to some sultans and some guys from the Middle East. And in their products and under their companies, they're trading in derivatives, right? They're doing oil drilling and oil exploring and all of that sort of thing. Why is that important to you? All you're running is a trust, right? But the issue is, you are, as the trustee, the legal owner of those risks, aren't you now? You are the legal owner of those risks. And you need to have systems in place. Because while you have never been to the place where they're drilling the oil or where they're refining it, you need to consider, what if that refinement plant blew up? What impact could it have on third parties, right? Which means you should have been there. So one part of your process is, you can't just onboard this business and never find out exactly what it is about. Again, if you are hearing me clearly, all we're talking about is, yeah, we say compliance, but in a real way, we're also saying what? We ain't got to lunch yet, so we shouldn't be this quiet. We are saying compliance, but we having the same conversation as this morning, aren't we? It's about risk management. Volume and size of transaction, that explains itself. So, in doing some research, I came up with this guy. Well, actually, it's a legal firm. They have a paper on that. So I decided, rather than reinvent the wheel, because they can say better than I do, copy and paste, I'm declaring that those are not my words. So it says, this is a 3-step approach that they are proposing to developing and designing the system. So the first is, the designer needs to determine what organization compliance system should contain and look like. And he said, in his view, the essential elements are these. 1, a policy setting out the organizational view on compliance from board and setting organizational governance, compliance, and risk tolerance expectation. So right at the top, you're defining what your appetite is, what your approach to risk is, and what sort of risk culture you want to create within your organization. You see that? That's what that is saying. Then you have a comprehensive legal risk assessment review to ensure that the compliance system is dealing with the right risk. No sense setting up a system which is good and well, have all of the bells and whistles, but you haven't properly defined the problems. The problem definition, and in this case, risk identification, is very important. You can have an effective you can have a good risk management system, right? Which is managing risk. But if it's managing the wrong risk, because remember we talk about your objective, if it's managing something which is not important to you, it's not effective. Appropriate documentation describing how the system works, who has responsibility for what compliance obligation and control applicable to the organization, and who's operating the compliance system and how the system is to be kept relevant and current. Who is your MLRO? Who is your compliance officer? What's the compliance committee responsible for? What is the board at large responsible for? How often will you update your regulation? Who, your policies and procedure? Who is scanning the horizon for things which are happening? An effective company don't wait until things are in black and white. They're always scanning. Who's reading the news? Who's looking at what's coming out from Bank of International Settlement, OECD? So even before they get to the FSC, the BIS has put out oodles and oodles of paper on its website. Who's scanning those to understand what's coming down the pipe? So you need to know what control mechanisms are in place to ensure that people are acting in accordance with the compliance system, including reporting, monitoring, and supervision. Now you set it up, you need to have ways of checking it. Somebody breached the rules, do you tap them on the hand and send a message that we are not serious about compliance risk, even though up here we said we are serious? Or do we have disciplinary penalties in place? That is important. You have to look at the operational processes and procedures to assist frontline staff on an operational basis. A lot of times the people in this room, maybe for the most part, not always going to be touching the staff. Sometimes you're the trainers, you're kind of like a puppeteer. You're behind the scene making sure things happen. You have to empower the people on the front line. How do you train them? What type of material you provide for them? Do they come to seminars like this so that they can understand exactly what compliance is about? General training, see, we talked about that, right? Understanding both the how and the why. Very important. There's a lot of people who can do things. That's the how. Ask them why they're doing it, and they get it wrong. And why is that important? As long as what you're doing is the same every single time, you're fine. But the moment something changes, by you not understanding the why, you cannot make the adjustment. Right? Why do we have a list of PEPs? Why do we create a list of PEPs? So that we can identify persons who are politically exposed. So let's say all of the people in this room are PEPs. So we have a list and all of your name on there. So say every time a PEP turn up, we need to do X, Y, Z. Good? Okay. You come in, you're a PEP? Okay. Why are you a PEP? Why are you on that list? The individual doesn't understand it. And so somebody who's not inside this room at this moment then turns up, who's a PEP? And they can't function. They don't know what to do, so they do something else. And that then causes exposure on your organization. Right? So you need to allow persons to understand both the how and the why. And vitally, the structural relationship between compliance and other key functions of the organization, such as, here we go again, governance, risk, audit, legal counsel, and HR function and personnel, contracting incentive system if that's applicable. In my view, the structure and interaction between the key controls area of the business will ultimately determine the success of the business compliance system and ultimately the culture of the organization. If you have a particular business type dealing with a particular type of risk, which is complex, your HR function becomes important. So compliance is not just about the compliance thing itself. Because if you don't employ the right type of person, you are going to get it wrong. I like to tell people, if you put in the best system, right? When looked at in isolation, this is the best system in the universe. The best policy, the best procedure. And forgive my word, if you give it to a fool to run, it's one of the most foolish systems you can find in the world. It's not going to work. So don't divorce yourself from the fact that HR plays a function in retention, recruitment, your disciplinary actions sends the message which helps to undergird the culture, right? So HR, don't fire the guy, don't reprimand him. The guy who takes all the risks gets all the bonus. What type of organization you're going to have? Well, not all the risks, but takes bad risks, makes bad decisions. You have to make sure that that works. You have to understand that your governance process, what is getting reported to the board? How are the boards staying informed? How do they get this information? What the quality of the information? The timeliness of the information? Do they understand it? That's always one of the tricks with the boards. A lot of time, the persons on the board are smart people in and of themselves. They're smart in the area of their competency. They come into your business and they bring that value, but they don't necessarily understand the business. Thank you, don't stop there. The people who understand the business are usually the executives, and that's why the board employ them. So there's some sort of teaching going on here. The board will help you to guide the strategic thrust of the organization. The executive have to help the board to understand the business. Over time, obviously, they'll understand more of the business. So that's where it becomes a symbiotic relationship. That must take place. So the second step is what? We need to ensure that all the stakeholders are considered. So it's not just, okay, we need to be concerned about FOC because we know Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins can be a little bit rough sometimes. That's not true.
No.
Incidentally, the first time I did anything on regulation was because Mr. Higgins pointed me in a particular direction. So I have a lot to be thankful for. I know he's a stern guy, I know that for sure. I used to work with him. So it's not only the regulator. You have to consider the customer, you have to consider the staff, you have to consider your suppliers, yeah? You have to consider organizations. You know, so you have I don't know, you have a compliance association here? No? Not yet?
Yes.
Yes? Last time I was here, that was in the works, right? So you have to take these things into consideration. Where are you going to get competent people? What sort of training is going to be provided? So stakeholders are important. So don't just run about and say, okay, I'm going to do this, and don't take those people into consideration. Thirdly, this review and implementation plan needs to be wholeheartedly endorsed and supported by the board, senior management of the organization, and implemented via compliance committee or staff committee. This, I think, is flexible depending on the size of your organization. But the one thing which is not flexible, negotiable, or shouldn't be variable, is the fact that compliance should have real clout. It won't work if compliance doesn't have teeth. It's like a dog that barks on the while and don't bite. If there's not the necessary clout, it won't be able to enforce the sort of culture which is necessary. So you have to make sure, and I think the laws and your regulations speaks to the fact that your compliance officers should be sufficiently senior. Yeah? Don't just pick up somebody from the door and put them and say, okay, doorman, the law says I need to have a compliance officer, so you the compliance officer now. I give you $2 more, and you're going to be the compliance officer. You comply with the letter of the law, but not with the spirit. That's not what this is about. So the implementation plan also should have regards to laws, codes, and rules. We talked about that. Inherent in the plan will be the need for initial assessment of the key exposed areas that require immediate action and a prioritization of compliance attention and resources thereafter. So let's assume, and this is not the case here, let's assume that you had no plan, no systems in place, right? Once you start building your system, you need to do a gap analysis. What are the rules which I need to comply with? Where am I currently? What's the gap between those two? And therefore, I start to work on them right away. This requires immediate action because that's what the system is designed to do. Once you get beyond that, then the whole system of monitoring, reviewing, and so on makes that an iterative process. You keep doing that over and over and over. So two critical factors which is needed in terms of designing the compliance system. And we talked about it earlier. You need a system and controls. You need some doors with some locking mechanisms on them. So you need internal controls, you need policies, and you need procedures, right? You need to put the door on, you need to get the best lock money can buy, and you need to tell your kids exactly how they should operate in terms of securing the house. That's the policy. The policy is Nobody comes in this house unless I as the father sanction them. Right? The procedure is when you come, you wear proper clothes, you leave your shoes at the door, and you don't behave in particular ways. That's what it is. You have systems of controls. And then you have to look at the culture and the attitude towards compliance. What's the culture? What's the attitude? Anybody want to proffer definition of culture for me? What's culture? It's not an exam. We're not going to get it wrong. What's culture? Huh? A system of behavior. Okay. System of behavior. That's behavior. Anybody else? Huh? Dress code, norms. Okay, good. So, for those who can't see, I have on the board attitude, behavior, and culture. A, B, C. Right? I got to go in my pocket, put over my notes, make sure I won't leave nobody astray. Right? So, you have the attitude towards your culture. That's what drives your behavior. If you don't care, what are you going to do? You're going to behave in a manner which shows that you don't care, right? And ultimately, that is going to create, when you look at your organization, when you zoom out and you have a bird's eye view, right? It's going to create a culture of persons who don't care. So let me read this definition for you, for culture. The values, if you want to write it when I go slow, the values, beliefs, knowledge, and understanding, the values, beliefs, knowledge, and understanding shared by a group of persons or people with a common purpose. Anybody got that? Let me see somebody. Who write that down? By show of hand, who write that down? Okay. Read that back to me, please.
Values, beliefs, knowledge, and understanding shared by a group of persons or people with a common purpose.
Do you see anything in that we spoke about this morning? Is there anything in there that we spoke about this morning?
Common purpose.
Common purpose. That's another term for our objectives. See, the behavior itself can be important, may not be important. The issue is we have a common purpose. So if we want to be super fast, right, we should be at the track every day training. True? That's our common purpose. You are able to therefore judge the efficacy of my behavior based on my common purpose, right? So if I tell you I'm going to the Olympics, but you see me each day in Burger King eating, now you can judge my behavior, right? Yeah. So my attitude, which says, I can go there and I can win, my attitude is, I don't have to train. It drives my behavior. My behavior is, I'm not going to train. I'm just going to goof off, right? And then that is going to create the values and the beliefs. My values and my belief is I can get by without putting in the hard work, right? Obviously, that is also going to dictate my outcome. So chances are you have an institution like this, using our Olympic example, that could also be defined as having a culture of losing. Because they are not going to win at what is good. right? So our beliefs, our values, and the knowledge that we have, right? And the understanding drives it. So that's what a culture is. And so the ABC, attitude, behavior, culture. Remember that. The attitude you take to that, the behaviors you're looking for. And that's why you have code of conducts in businesses, right? You said, we behave this way and not that way. That's not how we operate. We have performance standards, right? We have value statements. It says, we are the greatest. And then it's how are we going to become the greatest? We're going to become the greatest or stay being the greatest by doing these things. So that's important there. So the culture touch on the tone at the top, which is the board, how the board view these things. Seriousness towards compliance, do we take it seriously? All right? Is this just a thing where we go in and it's a tick box situation? We talked about the cloud of compliance. So rather than having a fundamental approach to compliance, you just go in there, you create a bunch of checklists, you tick them off, and because you need to do this on an annual basis, you send that over to the FSC. But like I always say, the FSC is coming. Part of their job is they must review from time to time on site. Yes or no?
Yes.
They come in. And they will figure out what is it that you're doing or not doing. And so you got to take that into consideration. So defining the roles and responsibility, we need to carefully define what the role of senior management is. What does the board get? What does the board do? What sort of decision the boards have to make, right? One needs to go to the compliance committee. What role is senior management? You have the MLRO, MLPO, I think you call it MLCO. Different terms are used. This is the money laundering prevention officer. A lot of times these two functions are merging, you don't have a different person. What's the role of the compliance officer and the sort of things that they need to carry out? And if you go back to the scenario that we read just before we break, right? This will impact it. One of the roles of the compliance officer is to help with the onboarding of business, yeah? In that scenario, those businesses were onboarded without giving it to the compliance officer. Multidisciplinary approach. You have to consider the fact that you look at the role of risk management as a function. You have to look at the role of internal audit, legal counsel, operational management, the people who are doing the ongoing business, the people who are bringing in the business, the people who are sitting down and doing the finances, that has to be taken into consideration, and of course, human resources. Interestingly, your compliance function has a very unique relationship with the internal audit because it needs to be reviewed, not because I say so, but because the Bank of International Settlement says at least annually, internal audit should review the function of compliance.
How does that work in a 3 or 4 person business?
How does it work in a 3 or 4 person business? You say to Mr. Simons at the FSC that I understand what the Bank of International Settlement says, but we only have 4 persons in it. So let's strip away the words and let's get to the principle. It needs to be reviewed by internal audit. We do not have an internal audit function. But at its essence, it requires an independent review. True? Do you have an independent entity that reviews you?
Or external auditor?
Or external auditor.
So you pay your external auditor.
Exactly. So what you do is that you ensure that a review of your compliance function is scoped into your external audit. And they do that anyway. They're going to do that because they want to make extra money. I used to be an auditor. But definitely, because it's part and parcel of the risk management system, they cannot extend an opinion on the effectiveness of your overall risk management without looking at that. So what you want to do is to ensure that the essence of that is covered. So they may do a little bit more than they would have if you had an internal function. If you had an internal audit function, what they would have done is take the work of that internal auditor and decide whether or not they can rely on it. All right? So there are ways of dealing with the same, but what you have to do is to engage and have the conversation. Don't just sit out there and say, we don't have internal audit, We only have 3 persons, so we can't do it. You have to speak to the efficacy of the
Excuse me.
process.
But where there seems to be where there's a situation where the external auditors are involving themselves at an internal systems level on compliance, there are instances where
The external auditors are involved.
in exactly that function you just described, that their scope is broadened
Yeah.
to include that. There's still being pressure applied here for apparent, it seems to me, and this is what I want to put out in the open, for a separate function on top of that. Do I misunderstand that? Is it, well, let me rephrase the question. In the Bahamas, where there are small operators, such as the 3 or 4 man operation, that under the presumably licensing requirements there's a external audit completed, and those audited financials are sent to the central bank,
Yeah.
the regulator. Is that internal audit function that you're just describing part of that package, that annual package?
In some instances.
It is.
In some instances.
Okay, thanks.
But here's where we go back to respecting the regulations. If a condition of your license says you need to have this function in place, then obviously you have to have it. If there's no hard and fast discussion, now when I talked about the Bank of International Settlement, remember that's something which is out there from a respected organization, right? It's a principle, it's a best practice. But best practice don't mean it's a law, you have to do it. You can work around this by finding means of achieving the same. Now, if the regulators say you must do that, because that's a condition of your license, you have no choice. You have to do that, otherwise they pull your license. So, from my experience, and I worked as a bank examiner with the Central Bank of the Bahamas for a couple of years, it doesn't happen like that. There's always a discussion. There's always, quote-unquote, negotiation, all right? Granted, when the central bank digs its heel in, you can't move it, but there is room for discussion. And there's sometimes compromise, having regard to the fact that your size doesn't adequately allow you to do certain things. So,
but there are, there are members of the Financial Services Commission and a member of the board. Paul, what is the position?
Well, if I was to answer that, I think I would be running down the line to say that you have, it can't be the intention of the regulator to pile on additional costs. That's not going to achieve anything. The way I would look at it is about saying, well, what are you doing to effectively manage the risks within the business?
yeah.
Because, the focus has inevitably gone on to banks, but there's probably about 5 people here from banks.
Right.
So we've got to, the key here is how do people in the small organisations manage those risks, and there's got to be something that can give them that sort of comfort. But I would go back to the external auditors. I'll throw it back to Joe and say, look, I am not sure to what extent people would enjoy the fact that if they went to their auditor and said, I need you to do all this extra work, that's going to add to the cost. That can't be the panacea either. It has to be within the business and some external, some sort of independent review which tops up that. Just to pile it on the external auditor, I think is probably taking it a little bit too far.
Definitely agree. It's not a matter of pile on. For the external auditor to confidently express an opinion of financial statements, right? You have to be satisfied that your internal systems are working, that your controls are in place and there are no weaknesses. That's one of the reasons why you are going to have policy positions. You're going to have manuals in place, procedure manuals, to create a benchmark. If you are a 1 or 2 person shop, you may still have a board. There's certain things which you need to report to the board to make sure that that is being reviewed on an ongoing basis. You can have systems where, okay, once a year, we are going to have a situation where we outsource a review to an entity. That may be one approach. But you have to take into consideration the cost factor. Is it worthwhile to do that? Can you demonstrate to the regulators that you have all of this covered by showing, here are my controls, here's the work that we've been doing, here's the reporting that we're sending up to the board, and the board is satisfied that everything is okay. And in addition to that, I am also fulfilling my reporting requirement to the FSC, and they too come in and do from time to time an on-site review. So it's kind of hard to sit here and have a conversation, you know, in terms of one size fits all. You have to know what the specifics are for the company. Because a small company may be 4 or it may be 6. In that case, you can find space having regard to the necessary segregation of duty to have some sort of peer review, controlled self-assessments, stuff like that, right, can be used to ensure that you satisfy that the system is working. All right?
Excuse me, sorry, I've got another question. Go back to that last slide, please. Certainly for myself, that second bullet point down, MLPO, that's the first time I've ever seen reference to a money laundering prevention officer.
Yes.
I'm intrigued by that because I think most of us would see ourselves in that de facto position on a day-to-day basis. But I've never seen it formalized, and certainly I've never seen it from the TCI FSC, any reference to MLPO.
You may be right. I've seen in the regulation referred to MLCO. I'm not sure what that is, but the MLPO has in many ways merged, like as I mentioned before, merged with the MLRO. Now the major focus of the MLRO is its relationship to the reporting agency.
Well, that's the key to
outside.
That's the key to this.
Yeah. So the MLRO is supposed to be this independent individual who acts independently, and when there are issues, report these to the FIU. The money laundering prevention officer, or the role that that person takes on, is making sure that there's adequate training, that you have the right policies, you have the right materials and stuff in place. What happens in real terms is that this individual, compliance officer, does all of it. So there's, depending on the size, there may be a merger here or a merger there. Because this individual really doesn't need to be uber independent, they are only called to be an individual who shirks off any potential influence from senior management in making the decision whether to report or not to report. It's possible for them to carry out some of that function.
The main reason I'm interested in pursuing that at a, should we say, an official or regulatory level is because it speaks to something we grapple with continuously, which is why are you not filing more suspicious activity reports? Why is the MLRO asleep at the wheel? Is he not? Why is he not? Why are we not getting sufficient reports? And my response tends to be because the MLPO is doing such a good job.
That may be one reason.
But there doesn't seem to be official recognition of that concept.
Yeah, if you have effective training and effective systems in place, then the incident of reporting obviously will be low because you're doing the right thing. Your argument could be taken in another way. If those two functions are merged, right? The reason you're not having a lot of reporting is because this guy don't want people to discover that they're not doing such a good job.
Yeah, no, I take that point, but I think the whole concept of MLPO is one that I think should be pursued personally.
Yeah, it's definitely.
But to my understanding,
going back to that.
there is no such creature under our legislation at the moment of an MLPO.
But I think the MLCO.
I think the MLCO
It's a compliance
is
officer.
pretty much the same
But
thing.
there isn't a specific creature under our legislation. It's a money laundering compliance officer.
The MLCO is the money laundering compliance officer. Okay. All right.
Is it recognized in the Bahamas, MLPO?
MLPO initially, yes, but they've gone away for the most part. They're going away.
If I could just say that I think the reality in this jurisdiction is those three roles that invariably are one. I think we're going to get locked into, semantics here if we're going to start thinking about the different roles. It's just that MLRO has to have that position where they can report independently, but the MLRO is expected to ensure that standards are high in anti-money laundering issues. In what's by leadership as well as compliance reviews.
All right, so let's move on. Good lively discussion. The role of the compliance department, this is what the function is. Generally, we can look at it like this, right? One, they need to fully understand the rules which a company must comply with. So that's the laws, the regulation from the regulators, and any internally self-imposed regulations too. Because regardless of what the law says, or regardless of what the regulations say, you may decide, I am not doing business with persons from XYZ country. That's self-imposed. I'm not doing business with persons who need a particular profile. So the compliance officer needs to understand that, or the compliance department, and in fact, the wider organization which is conveyed through training. Identify the risks that the organization faces and advise on them. See, the compliance department needs to identify the risk as it relates to compliance issue. Risk identification. Again, here's the tie to risk management. They need to design and advise on controls to protect the organization, prevention or mitigation. They should be able to monitor, report on the effectiveness of those controls in the management of the company's exposure. So they're doing the monitoring, they're doing the detection. They carry out independent reviews. They carry out various annual reviews, right? So they are able to unearth what's happening there. And they resolve issues. They resolve issues with the regulators. They resolve issues with the board. They resolve issues with management. Give you a typical example. The most junior staff of your company, right, because it just went through this anti-money laundering training program and now know all of the red flags, right? See somebody coming with a piece of business and the transaction is moving very fast, maybe about 3 within a month, right? And say, oh good, I need to report that. So the person's put up a UATR, an unusual transaction report. Once that is done, it's then sent to that person manager, and that person manager passes it on to the compliance function. The compliance function reviews it and determines we don't need to make a report here. They can't just leave it at that, or they shouldn't just leave it at that. They should go back down the chain and say, here are the reasons why we shouldn't report it. But this young junior guy who knows everything jumps up and says, that should be reported. Here's an opportunity for a resolution. Or flip that another way. This is something which should be reported. It goes all the way up to the MLRO, and the MLRO decide that I am going to report. But a member of the board or some members of the board said, you can't do that. That don't meet any standard of being reported, right? Again, the compliance function, the compliance officer and the MLRO, they need to sit down and they need to discuss and explain why. Now, if the board insisted, based on legislation, the MLRO can go ahead and do that. And that's what they should do. If I'm in the Bahamas, I usually refer to that as the Foxhill Clause. I'm not sure what you call it here, but I think you have a Her Majesty's something. Yeah? Where if you don't do that, you go to jail. The MLRO is always empowered to act independently despite. And so, in the interest of running an amicable organization, in the interest of the fact that relationships are necessary, you have to sit down and have the resolution. Not that it won't be reported, but you get the other party to understand the why. And you advise the company on the rules and controls. So here it is again in this slide. What we've shown is that the compliance department, whether it's one person, compliance officer only, or a big group of persons, they are in fact undertaking risk management on an ongoing basis. They're identifying, they're preventing, they're monitoring, and they're reporting. And that's what risk management, in a nutshell, is largely about. So, in order to bring out some other aspects of what's needed in the system, we're just going to run through very quickly some of the compliance officer rules, and then we look at a couple of things which regulators ask for. And I'm going to try to just use these rules and blend in exactly what you would expect in the system. So, the compliance officer is supposed to provide guidance on how to apply and interpret those regulations. So they need that knowledge, identify the regulation, we talked about that, measure, assess, and impact the process and the procedures, provide guidance, right? The person in your organization who should best understand when the FSC come out with a set of procedure should be your compliance officer, your compliance department, right? They're the expert. So they're supposed to be reading through it, delving in it, summarizing and saying exactly how it impacts the organization and what sort of input it holds for it, right? And then assess the effectiveness of the processes and procedure in place to manage compliance risk. They should be telling executive and by extension also the board whether or not they have systems in place which can effectively manage these risks. That's what the function is there. So that's the role of the compliance officer. Participate in training. So training is an important part of your compliance system. So very, very important part. If you don't train people, you can't expect them to do what they're supposed to do, right? They should be able to identify business risks, provide senior management with information on how identify business risks might be managed. So now we know there's a problem. How are we going to fix this? Bring me some solution. Bring me the system that we have in place. Provide management with information on regulatory compliance. Assist in managing good relationships with the regulators. There's some regulators in the house, right? So I'm just going to whisper to the rest of you. It's very important, very, very important that you maintain an amicable relationship with your regulators.
And vice versa.
No, apparently not. It's important that the regulators do recognize that part of their role is to facilitate business.
Thank you.
That is important. Regulators know that. I know Mr. Simons and they know that. But one of the reasons you need to never ever take an antagonistic approach to the regulator is because the regulator is there to assist you. And you cannot work out issues in an antagonistic manner. And so the role of those persons liaising with the regulator is therefore very, very important. You need to understand them and allow them to understand you. It doesn't always work out like that because, of course, we live in a world of uncertainty, and there's always the risk of misunderstanding. But as much as you can, you need to develop that good relationship. And you need to help to develop a culture based on honesty, fairness, and respect for the spirit of the law. You can hide a lot of things for a little while, but sooner or later it will be found out. Regulators have ways of finding out things. And if you cover up a customer, for example, who is very risky, sooner or later that customer is going to mess up and mess you up. And then all the business will be out there in the street, right? So you gotta be very careful. I'll skip through these two slides. What are some of the skills that you need to have for an effective compliance officer? That person should be able to influence. You need good communication skills. Business awareness and pragmatism. I'm not using pragmatism here in a bad sense. Listen, compliance officers are not there to block business. They're there to facilitate business. Remember we talked about earlier, what the purpose of risk management? It's about value what? Protection of value, right? And enhancement of shareholder value. That's what they're doing. So you have to recognize that if you make the decision to turn down every piece of business, then there'll be no value created. So it's a negotiation, there's a trade-off. There's some zones where there's a no-go, but there are some areas where, okay, we can do this, but we can put the requisite system in place to manage and mitigate that, right? You need good negotiation skills, good listening skills. Shouldn't be talking all the time and telling people what not to do and what to do, and you do it. All right, listen and get a perspective, because there's a lot to learn in between them. Good knowledge of regulatory compliance, and that's why programs like these are important. That's why going back to the laws are important. That's why reading your guidance notes are important. All of those things are needed, right? And you need to have good management skills. You can picture this, we talk about that. Risk-based compliance monitoring. It's very important, right? It's very important that persons in compliance and management at large understand that there's no way that you can do all things and be all things to all people. So that's why the risk-based approach is important. And therefore, your compliance system must be discriminating. In this way, discrimination is not a bad thing. It must be discriminating. In fact, what is going to happen is, at the front end, you cannot take on every single piece of business. It has to discriminate. Having taken on all of the business that you have, you cannot then treat them all in the same way. Some will be high risk, some will be medium, and some will be low. If you spend all your time throwing resources at your low risk, right, and chances are you have a lot of them, you're going to lose money to begin with. But in the big scheme of things, because we're talking about compliance and risk, you're not going to have a system in place which is effective, because you're going to spend a lot of time looking at small things and missing big, important issues. So you need to take a risk-based approach to these things. Managing relationship, we talked about that. The regulators and the FIU is one of the group of persons that you want to make sure that your staff is sensitive, make sure that the compliance function is sensitive towards, and you have the internal auditors, the external auditors, lawyers, compliance association, and so on and so forth. Okay. What I'm going to do here is very quickly tell you some things about what regulators do. As I understand it, this may not be the exact same thing which is done here, but the principles are the same. And use that to give you a basis or a benchmark as to what your internal compliance systems should be addressing. So here is regulators coming in next week, right? And they are going to need some documents to look at. And here are some of the typical documents. They want details of ownership. Who owns this company? Beneficial ownership. So if you have A and B as nominee shareholders, and you hide some guys behind that with a trust, regulators are interested in the beneficial owners, not just the people who appear on bid. You need an organizational chart, so you need to see how the company is organized. You need chart structure for risk compliance. If you're a four-man company, then obviously this first chart covers that, right? You don't need to give them a second one, because you don't need a chart with one person. That doesn't work. Are there any breaches in the last 12 months? The regulators are calling on you to be honest. Give it to them, don't let them discover. All right? Fraud data, minutes of all recent board meetings, they may go back to the time they were there the last time. They have a determination. Any internal and external audit reports, the list of your principal employees, your compliance officer, your MLRO, your managing director, that sort of thing. Control documents, which would be your manuals and your procedural documents. That's the starting point. They're going to ask you for that because they need that in order to delve into that. What does this say to you? In order for you to have an effective system, develop a compliance system, you need to have manuals, but they're going to ask you for it. You need to have procedures, right? You should at least have an organizational chart so people know where they fall in and they can track the accountabilities, they know what the reporting lines are. You should have board meetings. You should keep minutes. That's very, very important. What was discussed, what decision was made is very important, because the regulators come behind and say, how is it that the board is in charge of this organization? The corporate governance system is not working because they don't understand, because nobody's reporting to them what the compliance issues are. Here's where the minutes suggest that you have proper reporting, whether it's quarterly, monthly, or whatsoever, and here are the issues, and here is how it's been resolved, and all the information is presented to the board. The board is operating effectively. All right? That's part of the evidence which goes into that whole issue. So here are some prerequisites that this is more from a banking perspective, but I'm going to sift through that to deal with the issues which may be important. Any significant change since the last examination? General description of your training programs since the last examination. Your examination programs for compliance should be documented. Persons who have been on courses, there should be evidence that they've been there. The type of material that you use should be documented. And this may be coming across to you as being, hodgepodge, but it's all part and parcel of your compliance system. You can't have an effective system without training, right? You can't have training without being able to demonstrate evidence, because the regulators are concerned about the competence level of the individual. What have they been exposed to? Okay, so they've been trained since 1979. We weren't too fussed about anti-money laundering then. The last time they went on training was 2001. What about the developments that took place in between that time, right? General description of your reputational risk or your anti-money laundering manuals. You need to have that. What sort of electronic reporting systems that you have in place if you have a company of that size, and which dictates that you have those in place, right? Important, a description of the role, designation, and responsibility of your compliance officer. What does the compliance officer do? You will have a job description. Job description to speak to what the role and what you're responsible for. And also your MLRO, right? And your recent internal reporting. Just speaking through it, I won't bore you too much because we mentioned some of these already. Management report on compliance programs and related issues, right? Suspicious activity reporting procedures. This is one of them where we always need to pause and think about it. There's no way for you to demonstrate that you have an effective system of reporting to the FIU, for example, if it's not recorded. So ABC staff reports an unusual transaction. Where's that documented? Do they pick up the phone and call you? Is there an email? Is there a format that is supposed to be captured in? Do you record it? Do you put it in a log, right? Can you demonstrate that while you haven't reported anything in the last 300 years, here is all the things which came to my attention, here is my examination of them, and here is the decision I have made, and this is why I didn't report it. Here's why that is important. Hindsight is always 20/20 true. A lot of times you make a decision not to report something, and because we operate in an environment where we don't have all of the knowledge all at the same time, we may make a decision based on what was in front of us there and then. Roll that forward to 2 years down the road, and something goes awry. Regulators come in and they say, why is it that you didn't report this? Show me how you investigated that. Show me the evidence that you looked at. And you have nothing to show them. You're up the creek, right? You're in trouble. However, if you are able to go back and say, based on the factors which then exist, here is what I have, and here's the decision which I've made, somebody look at it and objectively say, yes, based on that what you have there, and based on where we were then, I don't think you did wrong. But if you're not able to demonstrate that, then you could cast a different impression. And you could end up being sanctioned because persons don't think you have an effective system in place. Persons don't think you're making the right decision. So it's important that you make sure that your reporting process is well documented.
But I think in some cases for the smaller businesses, it's the owner stroke managing director who makes that decision before they come through the door. So the reason you don't get suspicious transaction reports, it's not somebody's taking them on a low level. I mean, the individuals say no before they come through the door.
You mean onboarding the business?
Yeah, they don't take it on. They see, they just don't take it on. If they see something that doesn't look right, they just won't touch it.
Yeah, but that's a decision for onboarding.
Right.
Having onboarded that individual.
Right, but I was saying, if you don't take anything on, if you don't take that on, then there won't be the reports. And again, I think to some extent it's different if you have a larger organisation where individuals may make decisions at a later date. Perhaps even the owners turn around and say, well, maybe we shouldn't have taken those guys on, and the system did win. But in smaller businesses, it's mostly the owner stroke managing director who's making that decision. So in a lot of cases, if there's any sense that it won't be right business, they simply don't take them on.
Okay, let's start out with a couple of things. One, managing director owner is human, won't be infallible. And secondly, this discussion has to be contextualized within the confines of you having already taken on the business. So the individual is now in your business and something goes awry. He's doing something which is different from the profile you anticipated, right? He's doing something which may be outside of best practice. How do you report that? Even if it's a two-man company, write it down. However the decision is made, document it. If you decide you're not going to report it, or you're going to report it, it doesn't matter. You have to have some sort of documentation to determine what you are. Let me flip this around a little bit more, right? There may be some lawyers here. I'm not a lawyer, so forgive me if I get this all wrong. But let's say you reported the incident to the FIU without any form of documentation, all right? Your client then goes to court because it's now a criminal event and found guilty. Hotshot lawyer puts you on the stand and say, why did you report it? Show me the basis on which you reported. And you cannot defend that position, right? It may very well be that this guy gets exonerated, or he still could be found guilty, criminally. But that doesn't preclude him from turning around and suing you on a civil basis. True or false, lawyers?
No, I think there's protection in the law for reporting within the regulations. That if you're doing your job within the regulations of reporting suspicious activity, you're protected.
Yes, that's true. But what if this entity totally messed this up, right? Reported the wrong thing. It wasn't really anything untoward. They can't demonstrate that they fully understand the business. The guy can demonstrate that as a result of that there was lost opportunity, lost business, lost money, impact to his reputation, blah, 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 right? He can still come at you. And I think that then presents you with a problem because you do not have a system on which you can go back and rely on. There's some excitement taking place up there. Reputational risk. He's been entertaining up here for a while. So you also have to, one of the things which form part of the system is the reporting which goes to the board, right? And it's very important that you follow these rules, general rules. You need to be concise, get to the point quickly, because usually your board of directors don't have a lot of time to sift through oodles and oodles of information. Especially as a small company, you want to be in, want to be out. The managing director, in that case, is doing everything, including sweeping the floor. You need to be concise, you need to be very clear. Don't get into the jargon. Yes, you are the compliance officer. Yes, you know all the laws and all of this stuff, but you can take it down to layman terms, right? And that's one of the things, when I do presentations, I try to do like the examples I've used this morning. not getting into any technical example. We can find a very simple way of communicating the information as long as it's effective. Do not use emotive or impassioned language, just be factual as possible, because you never know who is going to review it. Like, for example, don't say, don't say any bad thing about the regulators in your report. Because sooner or later, there is an outside review, and they're going to read it. And we are all humans, right? And we're going to feel bad, and that may reflect badly on you. So keep it very respectful, and keep it with the emotion out. Ensure that the content is accurate, and that because justification will be demanded. But once you write it down and you send it down, somebody say, well, no, this is totally wrong. Where you get this from? How can you support this? If you can't do that, then you may be in problem. So this is just a quick set of rules as to how you deal with the reporting. Because remember that we said up front, right? The compliance system is dealing with identification, it's dealing with mitigation, it's also dealing with reporting. That's typical structure there. You have executive summary. Boom, from the executive summary, you have a fair idea what it's about. You have the findings, you tell what the potential consequences, you deal what the remedial actions are, you give a timetable when they will be solved, and you say who's responsible. This one right here is very, very important for regulators. Regulators have a way of coming in and telling you when to fix things. I know that. I've written a couple of reports before. If you can preempt them and say, we will fix this in 6 months and demonstrate how we will fix it in 6 months, they may be okay with that. If not, you may find them coming in and say, I want this done now. I want this done in 2 months. And now you are under pressure. So always look at your remedial action, put a timetable. That's very important, because it then gives you sufficient space to properly manage your remedial approach. Okay. The report may have serious implications, even criminal, for individuals and the organization as a whole. Therefore, be objective, be balanced, and stick to the facts. All right? And that's the point for questions. So, before anybody asks, I know you have lots of questions. What I want to do is just to show you that in many ways, the risk management process provides the foundation, if you will, provides the principles, provides the groundwork. And it's the same thing which is happening once you start going into a specific area, in this case, the compliance. You're still doing risk management. And it's still important that you respect those principles. And this afternoon, when we come back, you will see how all of that again is tied into the governance. So you're always going to remember GRC. We have covered the R, and we've now covered the C. Later on, we are going to tackle the G. And when you read that scenario in front of you, one of the things you should, I'm not saying that you are, but one of the things that you should by this point in time, I've started to appreciate about that scenario, is that it covers incidents which cuts across all of those 3 areas. All right? So, any questions? Yes.
I think it's important to, just following up on some of the discussion that we've been having, to make a distinction between onboarding, and if you're more astute in your onboarding, then you're going to have less, or one should expect you to have less reporting.
Yeah.
That is one thing. But once someone is on board,
Right.
which is more of a risk for regular transaction-based organizations like remittance and
Right,
banks and
right.
so on, as opposed to consultants and law firms. Once they're on board, you have to be careful of how you think in terms of prevention. Because if somebody stands in front of you with a regular customer, somebody that is on board already,
Right.
with a transaction that you feel is suspicious, and follow me carefully now, it is not your duty to turn back that transaction. In fact, it may be illegal to turn back that transaction.
Possibly.
Right?
Maybe tipping off.
Tipping off, right?
Yeah.
So we need to focus on the reporting and the follow-up.
Yeah.
All right, in which case you will continue to have, a fair amount of reports. I say that because, I don't want anybody here to leave with the impression that, if I'm doing a good enough prevention, then I'm not going to have any reports.
No.
Because you could be getting yourself into another set of problems.
Yes. Because
with that approach.
you could be ignoring the risk.
Right.
The point is, once you take on the business, really, kind of that's when you work just that. And you have to therefore, that's why when you bring on a company, it may be different for different type of business. That's why a profile is done for, say, a trust company or somebody who's providing some sort of company management, right? You do the profile so that you can create a benchmark. This is what is normal, right? On all things being equal. That's what the economists will say, right? All things being equal, this is what we expect. Now there are days when it's going to be outside that. But that in and of itself doesn't mean that the transaction is illegal, is illicit, or what it does, it provides a trigger or a basis for you to spring into action. You need to understand now, why is this transaction outside of what I understand to be normal, right? And if you have some doubt, if you have some concerns, then your whole reporting mechanism chips in, right? And this is why we talk about unusual transaction rather than a suspicious transaction in the first instance. You want to make it unusual because it's outside the norm. You want to then apply some form of investigation, analysis, discussion, before you confirm whether or not it is suspicious. If you come to the end and you decide, yes, it's suspicious, it's now a suspicious transaction which requires reporting to the FIU. So if you follow my trend of thinking, and this is why I say it's important that you have these things recorded, you would get the unusual transaction, you investigate it, you document that, and you document your rationale. Your rationale says, I am not reporting this. End of story. You do the same process and you come to the end and you say, yes, I'm in fact satisfied that this is suspicion. And suspicion is not certainty, it's just suspicion. And once you get to that point, you decide, well, yes, it's a suspicious transaction. You report it to the FIU, and your job is done, like was mentioned. There's some safe harbors for doing that. The FIU may come back to you and say, okay, we have received that, and you may be saying, I don't want to do no business with this guy, right, because it's going to impact my business. But sometimes the regulators need you to work with them, and they may say, continue doing business with him because we don't want to tip him off. We have an investigation ongoing. That process too has to be managed. Because being human, because we know that this guy is under investigation, we may talk to him differently. We may give him a cold shoulder, right? Members of staff may not know how to operate because the situation is there. And here's where training comes in. Here's where talking to people. Understand, this guy is on an investigation. We have a legal obligation. We can't tip off, otherwise here's the implication. So when he calls you, have the normal conversations. When he calls, he used to be a very lively person. You would chit-chat, he would say, guess what? I'm just jumping off of my yacht and I've been to France and Venice. Engage him just the same as you would have in the past. That process needs to be managed. How do you get here? You get to that point because we talked about earlier, training, right? Sometimes it may look foolish, right? Because some of us are now grown and we are mature. But role playing is a very powerful tool to be used as part of your training process. Have somebody sit down and pretend to be the customer and somebody responding to him, and through that interaction, you kind of prepare yourself or prepare others to how that interaction may be. So it's very important that you bear in mind that it's not just the onboarding process, which is important, that's extremely important, but the ongoing monitoring, the ongoing review, the ongoing reporting is very critical to the success of your compliance system. the compliance process. Any other questions, comments? All right, how will you, Miguel?
Yeah,
What time is that?
lunch actually is now.
Okay, we're on schedule. So we are on schedule.
Just raise one point, just,
Your lunch is already paid for, so you're okay.
sorry, I missed that,
Yeah, you've already won your lunch, it's okay.
All right, right. Yeah, but I want dessert, right? When you went through all those slides where it said, you know, the regulators'
Yeah.
requirements, and I guess what I would like to say from a regulator's point of view is there's nothing extra in there that a normally well-run company should have. You could just easily do those slides and say compliance review. I know it's a bit sort of, we're here to be kicked and here to be made fun of, but the reality is the regulator is only asking one question to the board. How are you running that business so you know that your risks are being managed properly?
Yeah.
It's not this suite of information that the regulators want to look at to be happy. It is, if the board is not asking for that, then the business is not being run well. So
Definitely.
I don't want to, you know, and I'm sure I'm here to be short, but the reality is a compliance review would cover all that. If there's not organisation structures that are readily apparent, if there's not policies and procedures, if there's not management reporting, everything like that, if that's not happening, it's not the regulators who are really going to be upset. It's the business that's going to be upset because at some stage it will die.
Yeah. Again, context. Took it from the perspective of the regulator to give it clout and to underline the importance of it. But you're totally right. The point here is as simple as this. If you are, for the first time, doing minutes when the regulators say I'm coming, and that's the wrong time. So whatever it is that the regulator is asking you for is the things that you use in the company or you do in the company on a normal basis, right? So your policies and procedures have to be written and being used. You have to be having your meetings. You're supposed to be undertaking your independent reviews and your findings. If you are very effective, if you're very efficient, then all the findings that you have, if they were to do it over, would be the exact findings that they have. And they would say, okay, we're satisfied that you have pretty much everything covered. And so, if, I don't know, because that wasn't the intent, but don't walk away with the wrong impression that you're doing this for the regulators. You're doing this for the company and for the board. And if you were to put that in terms of a hierarchy, it's the business doing stuff, and the business has a responsibility to the entity, which is responsible for governance, which is the board. The board needs to satisfy itself, and that's why in your legislation, annually the board has to confirm to the regulators that they're satisfied that the business is running fine. The regulators are only taking that representation, evidenced by these things, to confirm that they too are satisfied that you're doing what you say you're doing. And that's pretty much what it is. So everything here is for the efficient running of the company. All right. Any other points? Any other comments? All right, let's do something very quickly. I honestly didn't think the group was going to be this big initiative. So this can be very, very interesting. Okay. We'll have a couple of groups, right? Each table. No, too big. 2 tables, that's one group right here. So this is one group, that's one group. So every 2 tables become a group, so you can just flip around. So that's group. So group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, group 5, group 6. So we have 6 groups. All right? How we go again? Group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, group 5, group 6. All right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take that scenario, right? And we're going to read through that. And then we're going to, after we come back, quickly go through the governance section. So we leave ourselves sufficient time. And then what we'll undertake is a risk management process We're going to identify, right? We're going to assess, we're going to categorize, and then we are going to apply some risk treatment. Yeah? Based on, I can put about the slide when we get to that point. And I really, really want you to give this a good shot. The one thing that asks you to do is, it's not an exam, it's not something you're going to get wrong or right, so use your imagination. Like, for example, we said we onboarded a number of individuals from Eastern Europe. If you were to throw in that a question of whether they are PEPs, and that's fine. All right, so use the imagination, make it spicy. What we'll do, therefore, is once we get through that process, we'll have one representative from each group. Just quickly come up and say, boom, 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 this is what we thought, these are the risks that we identified, and this is how we treat them. And we'll have a quick discussion on that and then wrap up later this evening. All right? So it's lunchtime. We'll come back.
Yeah, let's see if we can get back here in essence by 1:10. Stay on schedule. Thanks.
We get lunch.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, 1 second, ladies and gentlemen.
Security guard.
How you doing, man?
I'm good, man.
How your tennis, man?
Well, I was supposed to play this morning, but I had to come home. Play yesterday with Sandy. You could have probably come in today, but then he said he had
I come here and drink Chris House, yeah.
This is the former thing. Chris too busy, man. This fella said they're too busy to play.
Yeah. and he's playing, he's pretending as if he's not hearing us.
Hi, darling.
How you doing? Yeah.
Just starting, okay, we're just taking that lunch. Just taking that lunch. Yeah, I'm at the conference, yes.
I'll see you now.
Okay. I'm interested. All right, so here but Sandy and Marjorie are here. So we'll do that. Listen, can you call Vanessa for me and see what the story is and how we can handle the transfer? I haven't done that yet, but it's lunchtime now, so I can give them a call. Alright. Okay, alright. Let's come back and bust the